The Lodger, by Marie Belloc Lowndes. Chapter 15. The Buntings went to bed early that night, but Mrs. Bunting made up her mind to keep awake. She was set upon knowing at what hour of the night the lodger would come down into her kitchen to carry through his experiment, and, above all, she was anxious to know how long he would stay there. But she had had a long and a very anxious day, and presently she fell asleep. The church clock hard by struck 2, and suddenly Mrs. Bunting awoke. She felt put out, sharply annoyed with herself. How could she have dropped off like that? Mr. Sleuth must have been down and up again hours ago. Then gradually she became aware that there was a faint, acrid odor in the room. Elusive, intangible, it yet seemed to encompass her and the snoring man by her side, almost as a vapor might have done. Mrs. Bunting sat up in bed and sniffed, and then, in spite of the cold, she quietly crept out of her nice warm bedclothes and crawled along to the bottom of the bed. When there, Mr. Sleuth's landlady did a very curious thing. She leaned over the brass rail and put her face close to the hinge of the door giving into the hall. Yes, it was from here that this strange, horrible odor was coming. The smell must be very strong in the passage. As, shivering, she crept back under the bedclothes, she longed to give her sleeping husband a good shake, and in fancy she heard herself saying, "Bunting, get up! There's something strange and dreadful going on downstairs which we ought to know about." But as she lay there, by her husband's side, listening with painful intentness for the slightest sound, she knew very well that she would do nothing of the sort. What if the lodger did make a certain amount of mess, a certain amount of smell in her nice clean kitchen? Was he not an almost perfect lodger? If they did anything to upset him, where could they ever hope to get another like him? 3 o'clock struck before Mrs. Bunting heard slow, heavy steps creaking up the kitchen stairs, but Mr. Sleuth did not go straight up to his own quarters, as she had expected him to do. Instead, he went to the front door, and, opening it, put on the chain. Then he came past her door, and she thought, but could not be sure, that he sat down on the stairs. At the end of 10 minutes or so she heard him go down the passage again. Very softly he closed the front door. By then she had divined why the lodger had behaved in this funny fashion. He wanted to get the strong, acrid smell of burning—was it of burning wool?—out of the house. But Mrs. Bunting, lying there in the darkness, listening to the lodger creeping upstairs, felt as if she herself would never get rid of the horrible odor. Mrs. Bunting felt herself to be all smell. At last the unhappy woman fell into a deep, troubled sleep, and then she dreamed a most terrible and unnatural dream. Hoarse voices seemed to be shouting in her ear, "The Avenger close here! The Avenger close here! 'Orrible murder off the Edgware Road! The Avenger at his work again!" And even in her dream Mrs. Bunting felt angered and impatient. She knew so well why she was being disturbed by this horrid nightmare. It was because of Bunting. Bunting, who could think and talk of nothing else than those frightful murders, in which only morbid and vulgar-minded people took any interest. Why, even now, in her dream, she could hear her husband speaking to her about it. "Ellen," so she heard Bunting murmur in her ear, "Ellen, my dear, I'm just going to get up to get a paper. It's after 7 o'clock." The shouting, nay worse, the sound of tramping, hurrying feet smote on her shrinking ears. Pushing back her hair off her forehead with both hands, she sat up and listened. It had been no nightmare then, but something infinitely worse—reality. Why couldn't Bunting have lain quiet abed for a while longer and let his poor wife go on dreaming? The most awful dream would have been easier to bear than this awakening. She heard her husband go to the front door, and, as he bought the paper, exchange a few excited words with the newspaper seller. Then he came back. There was a pause, and she heard him lighting the gas ring in the sitting-room. Bunting always made his wife a cup of tea in the morning. He had promised to do this when they first married, and he had never yet broken his word. It was a very little thing, and a very usual thing, no doubt, for a kind husband to do, but this morning the knowledge that he was doing it brought tears to Mrs. Bunting's pale blue eyes. This morning he seemed to be rather longer than usual over the job. When at last he came in with the little tray, Bunting found his wife lying with her face to the wall. "Here's your tea, Ellen," he said, and there was a thrill of eager, nay, happy, excitement in his voice. She turned herself round and sat up. "Well?" she asked. "Well? Why don't you tell me about it?" "I thought you was asleep," he stammered out. "I thought, Ellen, you never heard nothing." "How could I have slept through all that din? Of course I heard. Why don't you tell me?" "I've hardly had time to glance at the paper myself," he said slowly. "You was reading it just now," she said severely, "for I heard the rustling. You begun reading it before you lit the gas ring. Don't tell me! What was that they was shouting about the Edgware Road?" "Well," said Bunting, "as you do know, I may as well tell you. The Avenger's moving west. That's what he's doing. Last time 'twas King's Cross. Now 'tis the Edgware Road. I said he'd come our way, and he has come our way." "You just go and get me that paper," she commanded. "I wants to see for myself." Bunting went into the next room. Then he came back and handed her silently the odd-looking, thin little sheet. "Why, whatever's this?" she asked. "This ain't our paper." "Course not," he answered a trifle crossly. "It's a special early edition of the Sun, just because of the Avenger. Here's the bit about it." He showed her the exact spot. But she would have found it, even by the comparatively bad light of the gas jet now flaring over the dressing-table, for the news was printed in large, clear characters. "Once more the murder fiend who chooses to call himself the Avenger has escaped detection. While the whole attention of the police and of the great army of amateur detectives who are taking an interest in this strange series of atrocious crimes were concentrating their attention round the East End and King's Cross, he moved swiftly and silently westward. And, choosing a time when the Edgware Road is at its busiest and most thronged, did another human being to death with lightning-like quickness and savagery. Within 50 yards of the deserted warehouse yard where he had lured his victim to destruction were passing up and down scores of happy, busy people, intent on their Christmas shopping. Into that cheerful throng he must have plunged within a moment of committing his atrocious crime. And it was only owing to the merest accident that the body was discovered as soon as it was, that is, just after midnight. Dr. Dowtray, who was called to the spot at once, is of opinion that the woman had been dead at least 3 hours, if not 4. It was at first thought, we were going to say hoped, that this murder had nothing to do with the series which is now puzzling and horrifying the whole of the civilized world. But no, pinned on the edge of the dead woman's dress was the usual now familiar triangular piece of grey paper, the grimmest visiting card ever designed by the wit of man. And this time the Avenger has surpassed himself as regards his audacity and daring, so cold in its maniacal fanaticism and abhorrent wickedness. All the time that Mrs. Bunting was reading with slow, painful intentness, her husband was looking at her, longing, yet afraid, to burst out with the new idea which he was burning to confide even to his Ellen's unsympathetic ears. At last, when she had quite finished, she looked up defiantly. "Haven't you anything better to do than to stare at me like that?" she said irritably. "Murder or no murder, I've got to get up. Go away, do." And Bunting went off into the next room. After he had gone, his wife lay back and closed her eyes. She tried to think of nothing. Nay, more, so strong, so determined was her will that for a few moments she actually did think of nothing. She felt terribly tired and weak, brain and body both quiescent, as does a person who is recovering from a long, wearing illness. Presently detached, puerile thoughts drifted across the surface of her mind like little clouds across a summer sky. She wondered if those horrid newspaper men were allowed to shout in Belgrave Square. She wondered if, in that case, Margaret, who was so unlike her brother-in-law, would get up and buy a paper. But no, Margaret was not one to leave her nice warm bed for such a silly reason as that. Was it tomorrow Daisy was coming back? Yes, tomorrow, not today. Well, that was a comfort at any rate. What amusing things Daisy would be able to tell about her visit to Margaret. The girl had an excellent gift of mimicry, and Margaret, with her precise, funny ways, her perpetual talk about "the family," lent herself to the cruel gift. And then Mrs. Bunting's mind, her poor, weak, tired mind, wandered off to young Chandler. A funny thing love was, when you came to think of it, which she, Ellen Bunting, didn't often do. There was Joe, a likely young fellow, seeing a lot of young women, and pretty young women too, quite as pretty as Daisy and 10 times more artful, and yet there! He passed them all by, had done so ever since last summer, though you might be sure that they, artful minxes, by no manner of means passed him by. Without giving them a thought. As Daisy wasn't here, he would probably keep away today. There was comfort in that thought, too. And then Mrs. Bunting sat up, and memory returned in a dreadful turgid flood. If Joe did come in, she must nerve herself to hear all that talk there'd be about the Avenger between him and Bunting. Slowly she dragged herself out of bed, feeling exactly as if she had just recovered from an illness which had left her very weak, very, very tired in body and soul. She stood for a moment listening and shivering, for it was very cold. Considering how early it still was, there seemed a lot of coming and going in the Marylebone Road. She could hear the unaccustomed sounds through her closed door and the tightly fastened windows of the sitting-room. There must be a regular crowd of men and women, on foot and in cabs, hurrying to the scene of the Avenger's last extraordinary crime. She heard the sudden thud made by their usual morning paper falling from the letter-box onto the floor of the hall, and a moment later came the sound of Bunting quietly going out and getting it. She visualized him coming back and sitting down with a sigh of satisfaction by the newly lit fire. Languidly she began dressing herself to the accompaniment of distant tramping and of noise of passing traffic, which increased in volume and in sound as the moments slipped by. When Mrs. Bunting went down into her kitchen everything looked just as she had left it, and there was no trace of the acrid smell she had expected to find there. Instead, the cavernous, whitewashed room was full of fog. But she noticed that, though the shutters were bolted and barred as she had left them, the windows behind them had been widely opened to the air. She had left them shut. Making a spill out of a twist of newspaper, she had been taught the art as a girl by one of her old mistresses, she stooped and flung open the oven door of her gas stove. Yes, it was as she had expected. A fierce heat had been generated there since she had last used the oven, and through to the stone floor below had fallen a mass of black, gluey soot. Mrs. Bunting took the ham and eggs that she had bought the previous day for her own and Bunting's breakfast upstairs and broiled them over the gas ring in their sitting-room. Her husband watched her in surprised silence. She had never done such a thing before. "I couldn't stay down there," she said. "It was so cold and foggy. I thought I'd make breakfast up here just for today." "Yes," he said kindly. "That's quite right, Ellen. I think you've done quite right, my dear." But, when it came to the point, his wife could not eat any of the nice breakfast she had got ready. She only had another cup of tea. "I'm afraid you're ill, Ellen?" Bunting asked solicitously. "No," she said shortly. "I'm not ill at all. Don't be silly. The thought of that horrible thing happening so close by has upset me and put me off my food. Just hark to them now!" Through their closed windows penetrated the sound of scurrying feet and loud, ribald laughter. What a crowd, nay, what a mob must be hastening busily to and from the spot where there was now nothing to be seen! Mrs. Bunting made her husband lock the front gate. "I don't want any of those ghouls in here!" she exclaimed angrily. And then, "What a lot of idle people there are in the world!" she said. End of Chapter 15. Chapter 16. Bunting began moving about the room restlessly. He would go to the window, stand there a while staring out at the people hurrying past, then coming back to the fireplace, sit down. But he could not stay long quiet. After a glance at his paper, up he would rise from his chair and go to the window again. "I wish you'd stay still," his wife said at last. And then, a few minutes later, "Hadn't you better put your hat and coat on and go out?" she exclaimed. And Bunting, with a rather shamed expression, did put on his hat and coat and go out. As he did so he told himself that, after all, he was but human. It was natural that he should be thrilled and excited by the dreadful, extraordinary thing which had just happened close by. Ellen wasn't reasonable about such things. How queer and disagreeable she had been that very morning, angry with him because he had gone out to hear what all the row was about, and even more angry when he had come back and said nothing because he thought it would annoy her to hear about it. Meanwhile Mrs. Bunting forced herself to go down again into the kitchen, and as she went through into the low, whitewashed place, a tremor of fear, of quick terror, came over her. She turned and did what she had never in her life done before, and what she had never heard of any one else doing in a kitchen. She bolted the door. But having done this, finding herself at last alone, shut off from everybody, she was still beset by a strange, uncanny dread. She felt as if she were locked in with an invisible presence, which mocked and jeered, reproached and threatened her, by turns. Why had she allowed, nay, encouraged, Daisy to go away for 2 days? Daisy, at any rate, was company, kind, young, unsuspecting company. With Daisy she could be her old sharp self. It was such a comfort to be with someone to whom she not only need, but ought to, say nothing. When with Bunting she was pursued by a sick feeling of guilt, of shame. She was the man's wedded wife. In his stolid way he was very kind to her, and yet she was keeping from him something he certainly had a right to know. Not for worlds, however, would she have told Bunting of her dreadful suspicion, nay, of her almost certainty. At last she went across to the door and unlocked it. Then she went upstairs and turned out her bedroom. That made her feel a little better. She longed for Bunting to return, and yet in a way she was relieved by his absence. She would have liked to feel him near by, and yet she welcomed anything that took her husband out of the house. And as Mrs. Bunting swept and dusted, trying to put her whole mind into what she was doing, she was asking herself all the time what was going on upstairs. What a good rest the lodger was having! But there, that was only natural. Mr. Sleuth, as she well knew, had been up a long time last night, or rather this morning. Suddenly the drawing-room bell rang. But Mr. Sleuth's landlady did not go up, as she generally did, before getting ready the simple meal which was the lodger's luncheon and breakfast combined. Instead, she went downstairs again and hurriedly prepared the lodger's food. Then, very slowly, with her heart beating queerly, she walked up, and just outside the sitting-room, for she felt sure that Mr. Sleuth had got up, that he was there already, waiting for her, she rested the tray on the top of the banisters, and listened. For a few moments she heard nothing. Then through the door came the high, quavering voice with which she had become so familiar. "She saith to him, stolen waters are sweet, and bread eaten in secret is pleasant. But he knoweth not that the dead are there, and that her guests are in the depths of hell." There was a long pause. Mrs. Bunting could hear the leaves of her Bible being turned over, eagerly, busily. And then again Mr. Sleuth broke out, this time in a softer voice. "She hath cast down many wounded from her, yea, many strong men have been slain by her." And in a softer, lower, plaintive tone came the words, "I applied my heart to know and to search and to seek out wisdom and the reason of things, and to know the wickedness of folly, even of foolishness and madness." And as she stood there listening, a feeling of keen distress, of spiritual oppression, came over Mrs. Bunting. For the first time in her life she visioned the infinite mystery, the sadness and strangeness of human life. Poor Mr. Sleuth, poor, unhappy, distraught Mr. Sleuth! An overwhelming pity blotted out for a moment the fear, aye, and the loathing she had been feeling for her lodger. She knocked at the door, and then she took up her tray. "Come in, Mrs. Bunting." Mr. Sleuth's voice sounded feebler, more toneless than usual. She turned the handle of the door and walked in. The lodger was not sitting in his usual place. He had taken the little round table on which his candle generally rested when he read in bed, out of his bedroom, and placed it over by the drawing-room window. On it were placed, open, the Bible and the concordance. But as his landlady came in, Mr. Sleuth hastily closed the Bible and began staring dreamily out of the window, down at the sordid, hurrying crowd of men and women which now swept along the Marylebone Road. "There seem a great many people out today," he observed, without looking round. "Yes, sir, there do." Mrs. Bunting began busying herself with laying the cloth and putting out the breakfast lunch, and as she did so she was seized with a mortal, instinctive terror of the man sitting there. At last Mr. Sleuth got up and turned round. She forced herself to look at him. How tired, how worn he looked. And how strange. Walking towards the table on which lay his meal, he rubbed his hands together with a nervous gesture. It was a gesture he only made when something had pleased, nay, satisfied him. Mrs. Bunting, looking at him, remembered that he had rubbed his hands together thus when he had first seen the room upstairs, and realized that it contained a large gas stove and a convenient sink. What Mr. Sleuth was doing now also reminded her in an odd way of a play she had once seen, a play to which a young man had taken her when she was a girl, unnumbered years ago, and which had thrilled and fascinated her. "Out, out, damned spot!" That was what the tall, fierce, beautiful lady who had played the part of a queen had said, twisting her hands together just as the lodger was doing now. "It's a fine day," said Mr. Sleuth, sitting down and unfolding his napkin. "The fog has cleared. I do not know if you will agree with me, Mrs. Bunting, but I always feel brighter when the sun is shining as it is now, at any rate trying to shine." He looked at her inquiringly, but Mrs. Bunting could not speak. She only nodded. However, that did not affect Mr. Sleuth adversely. He had acquired a great liking and respect for this well-balanced, taciturn woman. She was the first woman for whom he had experienced any such feeling for many years past. He looked down at the still covered dish and shook his head. "I don't feel as if I could eat very much today," he said plaintively. And then he suddenly took a half-sovereign out of his waistcoat pocket. Already Mrs. Bunting had noticed that it was not the same waistcoat Mr. Sleuth had been wearing the day before. "Mrs. Bunting, may I ask you to come here?" And after a moment of hesitation his landlady obeyed him. "Will you please accept this little gift for the use you kindly allowed me to make of your kitchen last night?" he said quietly. "I tried to make as little mess as I could, Mrs. Bunting, but—well, the truth is, I was carrying out a very elaborate experiment." Mrs. Bunting held out her hand, she hesitated, and then she took the coin. The fingers which for a moment brushed lightly against her palm were icy cold, cold and clammy. Mr. Sleuth was evidently not well. As she walked down the stairs, the winter sun, a scarlet ball hanging in the smoky sky, glinted in on Mr. Sleuth's landlady, and threw blood-red gleams, or so it seemed to her, onto the piece of gold she was holding in her hand. The day went by, as other days had gone by in that quiet household, but of course there was far greater animation outside the little house than was usually the case. Perhaps because the sun was shining for the first time for some days, the whole of London seemed to be making holiday in that part of the town. When Bunting at last came back, his wife listened silently while he told her of the extraordinary excitement reigning everywhere, and then, after he had been talking a long while, she suddenly shot a strange look at him. "I suppose you went to see the place," she said. And guiltily he acknowledged that he had done so. "Well?" "Well, there wasn't anything much to see, not now. But oh, Ellen, the daring of him! Why, Ellen, if the poor soul had had time to cry out, which they don't believe she had, it's impossible someone wouldn't 'a' heard her. They say that if he goes on doing it like that, in the afternoon like, he never will be caught. He must have just got mixed up with all the other people within 10 seconds of what he'd done." During the afternoon Bunting bought papers recklessly. In fact, he must have spent the best part of 6 pence. But in spite of all the supposed and suggested clues, there was nothing, nothing at all new to read, less, in fact, than ever before. The police, it was clear, were quite at a loss, and Mrs. Bunting began to feel curiously better, less tired, less ill, less terrified than she had felt through the morning. And then something happened which broke with dramatic suddenness the quietude of the day. They had had their tea, and Bunting was reading the last of the papers he had run out to buy, when suddenly there came a loud, thundering double knock at the door. Mrs. Bunting looked up, startled. "Why, whoever can that be?" she said. But as Bunting got up, she added quickly, "You just sit down again. I'll go myself. Sounds like someone after lodgings. I'll soon send them to the right about." And then she left the room, but not before there had come another loud double knock. Mrs. Bunting opened the front door. In a moment she saw that the person who stood there was a stranger to her. He was a big, dark man with fierce black moustaches, and somehow, she could not have told you why, he suggested a policeman to Mrs. Bunting's mind. This notion of hers was confirmed by the very first words he uttered. For, "I'm here to execute a warrant," he exclaimed in a theatrical, hollow tone. With a weak cry of protest, Mrs. Bunting suddenly threw out her arms as if to bar the way. She turned deadly white. But then, in an instant, the supposed stranger's laugh rang out, with loud, jovial, familiar sound. "There now, Mrs. Bunting, I never thought I'd take you in as well as all that." It was Joe Chandler. Joe Chandler dressed up, as she knew he sometimes, not very often, did dress up in the course of his work. Mrs. Bunting began laughing helplessly, hysterically, just as she had done on the morning of Daisy's arrival, when the newspaper sellers had come shouting down the Marylebone Road. "What's all this about?" Bunting came out. Young Chandler ruefully shut the front door. "I didn't mean to upset her like this," he said, looking foolish. "'Twas just my silly nonsense, Mr. Bunting." And together they helped her into the sitting-room. But once there, poor Mrs. Bunting went on worse than ever. She threw her black apron over her face and began to sob hysterically. "I made sure she'd know who I was when I spoke," went on the young fellow apologetically. "But there now, I have upset her. I am sorry." "It don't matter," she exclaimed, throwing the apron off her face, but the tears were still streaming from her eyes as she sobbed and laughed by turns. "Don't matter one little bit, Joe. 'Twas stupid of me to be so taken aback. But there, that murder that's happened close by, it's just upset me altogether today." "Enough to upset anyone, that was," acknowledged the young man ruefully. "I've only come in for a minute, like. I haven't no right to come when I'm on duty like this." Joe Chandler was looking longingly at what remains of the meal were still on the table. "You can take a minute just to have a bite and a sup," said Bunting hospitably, "and then you can tell us any news there is, Joe. We're right in the middle of everything now, ain't we?" He spoke with evident enjoyment, almost pride, in the gruesome fact. Joe nodded. Already his mouth was full of bread and butter. He waited a moment, and then, "Well, I have got one piece of news, not that I suppose it'll interest you very much." They both looked at him. Mrs. Bunting suddenly calm, though her breast still heaved from time to time. "Our boss has resigned," said Joe Chandler slowly, impressively. "No, not the Commissioner of Police!" exclaimed Bunting. "Yes, he has. He just can't bear what's said about us any longer, and I don't wonder. He done his best, and so's we all. The public have just gone daft, in the West End, that is, today. As for the papers, well, they're something cruel, that's what they are. And the ridiculous ideas they print. You'd never believe the things they ask us to do, and quite serious-like." "What do you mean?" questioned Mrs. Bunting. She really wanted to know. "Well, the Courier declares that there ought to be a house-to-house investigation all over London. Just think of it! Everybody to let the police go all over their house, from garret to kitchen, just to see if the Avenger isn't concealed there. Dotty, I calls it. Why, 'twould take us months and months just to do that one job in a town like London." "I'd like to see them dare come into my house," said Mrs. Bunting angrily. "It's all along of them blarsted papers that the Avenger went to work a different way this time," said Chandler slowly. Bunting had pushed a tin of sardines towards his guest, and was eagerly listening. "How do you mean?" he asked. "I don't take your meaning, Joe." "Well, you see, it's this way. The newspapers was always saying how extraordinary it was that the Avenger chose such a peculiar time to do his deeds. I mean, the time when no one's about the streets. Now, doesn't it stand to reason that the fellow, reading all that, and seeing the sense of it, said to himself, 'I'll go on another tack this time'? Just listen to this." He pulled a strip of paper, part of a column cut from a newspaper, out of his pocket. "An ex-Lord Mayor of London on the Avenger. Will the murderer be caught? Yes," replied Sir John, "he will certainly be caught, probably when he commits his next crime. A whole army of bloodhounds, metaphorical and literal, will be on his track the moment he draws blood again. With the whole community against him, he cannot escape, especially when it be remembered that he chooses the quietest hour in the 24 to commit his crimes. Londoners are now in such a state of nerves, if I may use the expression, in such a state of funk, that every passer-by, however innocent, is looked at with suspicion by his neighbour if his avocation happens to take him abroad between the hours of 1 and 3 in the morning. I'd like to gag that ex-Lord Mayor," concluded Joe Chandler wrathfully. Just then the lodger's bell rang. "Let me go up, my dear," said Bunting. His wife still looked pale and shaken by the fright she had had. "No, no," she said hastily. "You stop down here and talk to Joe. I'll look after Mr. Sleuth. He may be wanting his supper just a bit earlier than usual today." Slowly, painfully, again feeling as if her legs were made of cotton wool, she dragged herself up to the first floor, knocked at the door, and then went in. "You did ring, sir," she said, in her quiet, respectful way, and Mr. Sleuth looked up. She thought, but, as she reminded herself afterwards, it might have been just her idea and nothing else, that for the first time the lodger looked frightened and cowed. "I heard a noise downstairs," he said fretfully, "and I wanted to know what it was all about. As I told you, Mrs. Bunting, when I first took these rooms, quiet is essential to me." "It was just a friend of ours, sir. I'm sorry you were disturbed. Would you like the knocker taken off tomorrow? Bunting'll be pleased to do it if you don't like to hear the sound of the knocks." "Oh, no, I wouldn't put you to such a trouble as that." Mr. Sleuth looked quite relieved. "Just a friend of yours, was it, Mrs. Bunting? He made a great deal of noise." "Just a young fellow," she said apologetically. "The son of one of Bunting's old friends. He often comes here, sir, but he never did give such a great big double knock as that before. I'll speak to him about it." "Oh, no, Mrs. Bunting. I would really prefer you did nothing of the kind. It was just a passing annoyance, nothing more." She waited a moment. How strange that Mr. Sleuth said nothing of the hoarse cries which had made of the road outside a perfect bedlam every hour or two throughout that day! But no, Mr. Sleuth made no allusion to what might well have disturbed any quiet gentleman at his reading. "I thought maybe you'd like to have supper a little earlier tonight, sir?" "Just when you like, Mrs. Bunting, just when it's convenient. I do not wish to put you out in any way." She felt herself dismissed, and going out quietly, closed the door. As she did so, she heard the front door banging to. She sighed. Joe Chandler was really a very noisy young fellow. End of Chapter 16. Chapter 17. Mrs. Bunting slept well the night following that during which the lodger had been engaged in making his mysterious experiments in her kitchen. She was so tired, so utterly exhausted, that sleep came to her the moment she laid her head upon her pillow. Perhaps that was why she rose so early the next morning. Hardly giving herself time to swallow the tea Bunting had made and brought her, she got up and dressed. She had suddenly come to the conclusion that the hall and staircase required a thorough doing down, and she did not even wait till they had eaten their breakfast before beginning her labours. It made Bunting feel quite uncomfortable. As he sat by the fire reading his morning paper, the paper which was again of such absorbing interest, he called out, "There's no need for so much hurry, Ellen. Daisy'll be back today. Why don't you wait till she's come home to help you?" But from the hall, where she was busy dusting, sweeping, polishing, his wife's voice came back. "Girls ain't no good at this sort of work. Don't you worry about me. I feel as if I'd enjoy doing an extra bit of cleaning today. I don't like to feel as anyone could come in and see my place dirty." "No fear of that," Bunting chuckled. And then a new thought struck him. "Ain't you afraid of waking the lodger?" he called out. "Mr. Sleuth slept most of yesterday, and all last night," she answered quickly. "As it is, I study him overmuch. It's a long, long time since I've done this staircase down." All the time she was engaged in doing the hall, Mrs. Bunting left the sitting-room door wide open. That was a queer thing of her to do, but Bunting didn't like to get up and shut her out, as it were. Still, try as he would, he couldn't read with any comfort while all that noise was going on. He had never known Ellen make such a lot of noise before. Once or twice he looked up and frowned rather crossly. There came a sudden silence, and he was startled to see that. Ellen was standing in the doorway, staring at him, doing nothing. "Come in," he said. "Do. Ain't you finished yet?" "I was only resting a minute," she said. "You don't tell me nothing. I'd like to know if there's anything new in the paper this morning." She spoke in a muffled voice, almost as if she were ashamed of her unusual curiosity, and her look of fatigue, of pallor, made Bunting suddenly uneasy. "Come in, do," he repeated sharply. "You've done quite enough, and before breakfast, too. 'Tain't necessary. Come in and shut that door." He spoke authoritatively, and his wife, for a wonder, obeyed him. She came in, and did what she had never done before, brought the broom with her, and put it up against the wall in the corner. Then she sat down. "I think I'll make breakfast up here," she said. I feel cold, Bunting." And her husband stared at her surprised, for drops of perspiration were glistening on her forehead. He got up. "All right, I'll go down and bring the eggs up. Don't you worry. For the matter of that, I can cook them downstairs if you like." "No," she said obstinately. "I'd rather do my own work. You just bring them up here. That'll be all right. Tomorrow morning we'll have Daisy to help see to things." "Come over here and sit down comfortable in my chair," he suggested kindly. "You never do take any bit of rest, Ellen. I never seed such a woman." And again she got up and meekly obeyed him, walking across the room with languid steps. He watched her, anxiously, uncomfortably. She took up the newspaper he had just laid down, and Bunting took 2 steps towards her. "I'll show you the most interesting bit," he said eagerly. "It's the piece headed, 'Our Special Investigator.' You see, they've started a special investigator of their own, and he's got hold of a lot of little facts the police seem to have overlooked. The man who writes all that—the special investigator—was a famous 'tec in his time, and he's just come back out of his retirement o' purpose to do this bit of work for the paper. You read what he says. I shouldn't be a bit surprised if he ends by getting that reward. One can see he just loves the work of tracking people down." "There's nothing to be proud of in such a job," said his wife listlessly. "He'll have something to be proud of if he catches the Avenger!" cried Bunting. He was too keen about this affair to be put off by Ellen's contradictory remarks. "You just notice that bit about the rubber soles. Now no one's thought of that. I'll just tell Chandler. He don't seem to me to be half awake, that young man don't." "He's quite wide awake enough without you saying things to him. How about those eggs, Bunting? I feel quite ready for my breakfast, even if you don't." Mrs. Bunting now spoke in what her husband sometimes secretly described to himself as Ellen's snarling voice. He turned away and left the room, feeling oddly troubled. There was something queer about her, and he couldn't make it out. He didn't mind it when she spoke sharply and nastily to him. He was used to that. But now she was so up and down, so different from what she used to be. In old days she had always been the same, but now a man never knew where to have her. And as he went downstairs he pondered uneasily over his wife's changed ways and manner. Take the question of his easy-chair. A very small matter, no doubt, but he had never known Ellen sit in that chair. No, not even once, for a minute, since it had been purchased by her as a present for him. They had been so happy and so restful during that first week after Mr. Sleuth had come to them. Perhaps it was the sudden dramatic change from agonizing anxiety to peace and security which had been too much for Ellen. Yes, that was what was the matter with her, that and the universal excitement about these Avenger murders, which were shaking the nerves of all London. Even Bunting, unobservant as he was, had come to realize that his wife took a morbid interest in these terrible happenings. And it was the more queer of her to do so that at first she refused to discuss them, and said openly that she was utterly uninterested in murder or crime of any sort. He, Bunting, had always had a mild pleasure in such things. In his time he had been a great reader of detective tales, and even now he thought there was no pleasanter reading. It was that which had first drawn him to Joe Chandler, and made him welcome the young chap as cordially as he had done when they first came to London. But though Ellen had tolerated, she had never encouraged, that sort of talk between the two men. More than once she had exclaimed reproachfully, "To hear you two, one would think there was no nice, respectable, quiet people left in the world." But now all that was changed. She was as keen as anyone could be to hear the latest details of an Avenger crime. True, she took her own view of any theory suggested. But there, Ellen always had had her own notions about everything under the sun. Ellen was a woman who thought for herself, a clever woman, not an everyday woman by any manner of means. While these thoughts were going disconnectedly through his mind, Bunting was breaking 4 eggs into a basin. He was going to give Ellen a nice little surprise, to cook an omelette as a French chef had once taught him to do, years and years ago. He didn't know how she would take his doing such a thing after what she had said, but never mind, she would enjoy the omelette when done. Ellen hadn't been eating her food properly of late. And when he went up again, his wife, to his relief, and it must be admitted to his surprise, took it very well. She had not even noticed how long he had been downstairs, for she had been reading with intense, painful care the column that the great daily paper they took in had allotted to the one-time famous detective. According to this special investigator's own account, he had discovered all sorts of things that had escaped the eye of the police and of the official detectives. For instance, owing, he admitted, to a fortunate chance, he had been at the place where the last 2 murders had been committed very soon after the double crime had been discovered. In fact, within half an hour, and he had found, or so he felt sure, on the slippery wet pavement imprints of the murderer's right foot. The paper reproduced the impression of a half-worn rubber sole. At the same time, he also admitted, for the special investigator was very honest, and he had a good bit of space to fill in the enterprising paper which had engaged him to probe the awful mystery, that there were thousands of rubber soles being worn in London. And when she came to that statement Mrs. Bunting looked up, and there came a wan smile over her thin, closely shut lips. It was quite true, that about rubber soles. There were thousands of rubber soles being worn just now. She felt grateful to the special investigator for having stated the fact so clearly. The column ended up with the words, "And today will take place the inquest on the double crime of 10 days ago. To my mind it would be well if a preliminary public inquiry could be held at once, say on the very day the discovery of a fresh murder is made. In that way alone would it be possible to weigh and sift the evidence offered by members of the general public. For when a week or more has elapsed, and these same people have been examined and cross-examined in private by the police, their impressions have had time to become blurred and hopelessly confused. On that last occasion but one there seems no doubt that several people, at any rate 2 women and 1 man, actually saw the murderer hurrying from the scene of his atrocious double crime. This being so, today's investigation may be of the highest value and importance. Tomorrow I hope to give an account of the impression made on me by the inquest, and by any statements made during its course." Even when her husband had come in with the tray Mrs. Bunting had gone on reading, only lifting up her eyes for a moment. At last he said rather crossly, "Put down that paper, Ellen, this minute. The omelette I've cooked for you will be just like leather if you don't eat it." But once his wife had eaten her breakfast, and, to Bunting's mortification, she left more than half the nice omelette untouched, she took the paper up again. She turned over the big sheets until she found, at the foot of one of the 10 columns devoted to the Avenger and his crimes, the information she wanted, and then uttered an exclamation under her breath. What Mrs. Bunting had been looking for, what at last she had found, was the time and place of the inquest, which was to be held that day. The hour named was a rather odd time, 2 o'clock in the afternoon, but, from Mrs. Bunting's point of view, it was most convenient. By 2 o'clock, nay, by half-past 1, the lodger would have had his lunch. By hurrying matters a little she and Bunting would have had their dinner, and Daisy wasn't coming home till tea-time. She got up out of her husband's chair. "I think you're right," she said in a quick, hoarse tone. "I mean about me seeing a doctor, Bunting. I think I will go and see a doctor this very afternoon." "Wouldn't you like me to go with you?" he asked. "No, that I wouldn't. In fact, I wouldn't go at all, you was to go with me." "All right," he said vexedly. "Please yourself, my dear. You know best." "I should think I did know best where my own health is concerned." Even Bunting was incensed by this lack of gratitude. "'Twas I said long ago you ought to go and see the doctor. 'Twas you said you wouldn't," he exclaimed pugnaciously. "Well, I've never said you was never right, have I? At any rate, I'm going." "Have you a pain anywhere?" He stared at her with a look of real solicitude on his fat, phlegmatic face. Somehow Ellen didn't look right, standing there opposite him. Her shoulders seemed to have shrunk, even her cheeks had fallen in a little. She had never looked so bad, not even when they had been half starving and dreadfully, dreadfully worked. "Yes," she said briefly, "I've a pain in my head, at the back of my neck. It doesn't often leave me. It gets worse when anything upsets me, like I was upset last night by Joe Chandler." "He was a silly ass to come and do a thing like that," said Bunting crossly. "I'd a good mind to tell him so, too. But I must say, Ellen, I wonder he took you in. He didn't me." "Well, you had no chance he should. You knew who it was," she said slowly. And Bunting remained silent, for Ellen was right. Joe Chandler had already spoken when he, Bunting, came out into the hall and saw their cleverly disguised visitor. "Those big black moustaches," he went on complainingly, "and that black wig—why, 'twas too ridiculous, that's what I call it." "Not to anyone who didn't know Joe," she said sharply. "Well, I don't know. He didn't look like a real man, nohow. If he's a wise lad, he won't let our Daisy ever see him looking like that." And Bunting laughed, a comfortable laugh. He had thought a good deal about Daisy and young Chandler the last 2 days, and on the whole he was well pleased. It was a dull, unnatural life the girl was leading with Old Aunt. And Joe was earning good money. They wouldn't have long to wait, these two young people, as a beau and his girl often have to wait, as he, Bunting, and Daisy's mother had had to do, for ever so long before they could be married. No, there was no reason why they shouldn't be spliced quite soon, if so the fancy took them. And Bunting had very little doubt that so the fancy would take Joe, at any rate. But there was plenty of time. Daisy wouldn't be 18 till the week after next. They might wait till she was 20. By that time Old Aunt might be dead, and Daisy might have come into quite a tidy little bit of money. "What are you smiling at?" said his wife sharply. And he shook himself. "I? Smiling? At nothing that I knows of." Then he waited a moment. "Well, if you will know, Ellen, I was just thinking of Daisy and that young chap Joe Chandler. He is gone on her, ain't he?" "Gone?" And then Mrs. Bunting laughed, a queer, odd, not unkindly laugh. "Gone, Bunting?" she repeated. "Why, he's out of sight. Right out of sight." Then hesitatingly, and looking narrowly at her husband, she went on, twisting a bit of her black apron with her fingers as she spoke. "I suppose he'll be going over this afternoon to fetch her? Or do you think he'll have to be at that inquest, Bunting?" "Inquest? What inquest?" He looked at her puzzled. "Why, the inquest on them bodies found in the passage near by King's Cross." "Oh, no, he'd have no call to be at the inquest. For the matter o' that, I know he's going over to fetch Daisy. He said so last night, just when you went up to the lodger." "That's just as well." Mrs. Bunting spoke with considerable satisfaction. "Otherwise I suppose you'd 'a' had to go. I wouldn't like the house left, not with us out of it. Mr. Sleuth would be upset if there came a ring at the door." "Oh, I won't leave the house, don't you be afraid, Ellen. Not while you're out." "Not even if I'm out a good while, Bunting." "No fear. Of course you'll be a long time if it's your idea to see that doctor at Ealing?" He looked at her questioningly, and Mrs. Bunting nodded. Somehow nodding didn't seem as bad as speaking a lie. End of Chapter 17. Chapter 18. Any ordeal is far less terrifying, far easier to meet with courage, when it is repeated, than is even a milder experience which is entirely novel. Mrs. Bunting had already attended an inquest, in the character of a witness, and it was one of the few happenings of her life which was sharply etched against the somewhat blurred screen of her memory. In a country house where the then Ellen Green had been staying for a fortnight with her elderly mistress, there had occurred one of those sudden, pitiful tragedies which occasionally destroy the serenity, the apparent decorum of a large, respectable household. The under housemaid, a pretty, happy-natured girl, had drowned herself for love of the footman, who had given his sweetheart cause for bitter jealousy. The girl had chosen to speak of her troubles to the strange lady's maid rather than to her own fellow servants, and it was during the conversation the two women had had together that the girl had threatened to take her own life. As Mrs. Bunting put on her outdoor clothes, preparatory to going out, she recalled very clearly all the details of that dreadful affair, and of the part she herself had unwillingly played in it. She visualized the country inn where the inquest on that poor, unfortunate creature had been held. The butler had escorted her from the hall, for he also was to give evidence, and as they came up there had been a look of cheerful animation about the inn yard. People coming and going, many women as well as men, village folk, among whom the dead girl's fate had aroused a great deal of interest, and the kind of horror which those who live on a dull countryside welcome rather than avoid. Everyone there had been particularly nice and polite to her, to Ellen Green. There had been a time of waiting in a room upstairs in the old inn, and the witnesses had been accommodated, not only with chairs, but with cake and wine. She remembered how she had dreaded being a witness, how she had felt as if she would like to run away from her nice, easy place, rather than have to get up and tell the little that she knew of the sad business. But it had not been so very dreadful after all. The coroner had been a kindly-spoken gentleman. In fact, he had complimented her on the clear, sensible way she had given her evidence concerning the exact words the unhappy girl had used. One thing Ellen Green had said, in answer to a question put by an inquisitive juryman, had raised a laugh in the crowded, low-ceilinged room. Ought not Miss Ellen Green, so the man had asked, to have told someone of the girl's threat? If she had done so, might not the girl have been prevented from throwing herself into the lake? And she, the witness, had answered, with some asperity, for by that time the coroner's kind manner had put her at her ease, that she had not attached any importance to what the girl had threatened to do, never believing that any young woman could be so silly as to drown herself for love. Vaguely Mrs. Bunting supposed that the inquest at which she was going to be present this afternoon would be like that country inquest of long ago. It had been no mere perfunctory inquiry. She remembered very well how little by little that pleasant-spoken gentleman, the coroner, had got the whole truth out. The story, that is, of how that horrid footman, whom she, Ellen Green, had disliked from the first minute she had set eyes on him, had taken up with another young woman. It had been supposed that this fact would not be elicited by the coroner, but it had been, quietly, remorselessly. More, the dead girl's letters had been read out. Piteous, queerly expressed letters, full of wild love and bitter, threatening jealousy. And the jury had censured the young man most severely. She remembered the look on his face when the people, shrinking back, had made a passage for him to slink out of the crowded room. Come to think of it now, it was strange she had never told Bunting that long-ago tale. It had occurred years before she knew him, and somehow nothing had ever happened to make her tell him about it. She wondered whether Bunting had ever been to an inquest. She longed to ask him. But if she asked him now, this minute, he might guess where she was thinking of going. And then, while still moving about her bedroom, she shook her head. No, no, Bunting would never guess such a thing. He would never, never suspect her of telling him a lie. Stop. Had she told a lie? She did mean to go to the doctor after the inquest was finished, if there was time, that is. She wondered uneasily how long such an inquiry was likely to last. In this case, as so very little had been discovered, the proceedings would surely be very formal and therefore short. She herself had one quite definite object, that of hearing the evidence of those who believed they had seen the murderer leaving the spot where his victims lay weltering in their still flowing blood. She was filled with a painful, secret, and yes, eager curiosity to hear how those who were so positive about the matter would describe the appearance of the avenger. After all, a lot of people must have seen him, for, as Bunting had said only the day before to young Chandler, the avenger was not a ghost. He was a living man with some kind of hiding place where he was known, and where he spent his time between his awful crimes. As she came back to the sitting-room, her extreme pallor struck her husband. "Why, Ellen," he said, "it is time you went to the doctor. You looks just as if you was going to a funeral. I'll come along with you as far as the station. You're going by train, ain't you? Not by bus, eh? It's a very long way to Ealing, you know." "There you go, breaking your solemn promise to me the very first minute." But somehow she did not speak unkindly, only fretfully and sadly. And Bunting hung his head. "Why, to be sure, I'd gone and clean forgot the lodger. But will you be all right, Ellen? Why not wait till tomorrow and take Daisy with you?" "I like doing my own business in my own way, and not in someone else's way," she snapped out. And then, more gently, for Bunting really looked concerned, and she did feel very far from well, "I'll be all right, old man. Don't you worry about me." As she turned to go across to the door, she drew the black shawl she had put over her long jacket more closely round her. She felt ashamed, deeply ashamed of deceiving so kind a husband. And yet, what could she do? How could she share her dreadful burden with poor Bunting? Why, 'twould be enough to make a man go daft. Even she often felt as if she could stand it no longer, as if she would give the world to tell someone, anyone, what it was that she suspected, what deep in her heart she so feared to be the truth. But unknown to herself, the fresh outside air, fog-laden though it was, soon began to do her good. She had gone out far too little the last few days, for she had had a nervous terror of leaving the house unprotected, as also a great unwillingness to allow Bunting to come into contact with the lodger. When she reached the Underground station she stopped short. There were two ways of getting to St. Pancras. She could go by bus, or she could go by train. She decided on the latter. But before turning into the station her eyes strayed over the bills of the early afternoon papers lying on the ground. Two words, "The Avenger," stared up at her in varying type. Drawing her black shawl yet a little closer about her shoulders, Mrs. Bunting looked down at the placards. She did not feel inclined to buy a paper, as many of the people round her were doing. Her eyes were smarting even now from their unaccustomed following of the close print in the paper Bunting took in. Slowly she turned, at last, into the Underground station. And now a piece of extraordinary good fortune befell Mrs. Bunting. The third-class carriage in which she took her place happened to be empty, save for the presence of a police inspector. And once they were well away, she summoned up courage and asked him the question she knew she would have to ask of someone within the next few minutes. "Can you tell me," she said in a low voice, "where death inquests are held?" She moistened her lips, waited a moment, and then concluded, "In the neighbourhood of King's Cross?" The man turned, and looked at her attentively. She did not look at all the sort of Londoner who goes to an inquest—there are many such—just for the fun of the thing. Approvingly, for he was a widower, he noted her neat black coat and skirt, and the plain princess bonnet which framed her pale, refined face. "I'm going to the coroner's court myself," he said good-naturedly, "so you can come along of me. You see, there's that big Avenger inquest going on today, so I think they'll have had to make other arrangements for, ordinary cases." And as she looked at him dumbly, he went on, "There'll be a mighty crowd of people at the Avenger inquest, a lot of ticket folk to be accommodated, to say nothing of the public." "That's the inquest I'm going to," faltered Mrs. Bunting. She could scarcely get the words out. She realized with acute discomfort, yes, and shame, how strange, how untoward was that which she was going to do. Fancy a respectable woman wanting to attend a murder inquest! During the last few days all her perceptions had become sharpened by suspense and fear. She realized now, as she looked into the stolid face of her unknown friend, how she herself would have regarded any woman who wanted to attend such an inquiry from a simple, morbid feeling of curiosity. And yet that was just what she was about to do herself. "I've got a reason for wanting to go there," she murmured. It was a comfort to unburden herself this little way even to a stranger. "Ah," he said reflectively. A relative connected with one of the two victims' husbands, I presume?" And Mrs. Bunting bent her head. "Going to give evidence?" he asked casually, and then he turned and looked at Mrs. Bunting with far more attention than he had yet done. "Oh, no!" There was a world of horror, of fear in the speaker's voice. And the inspector felt concerned and sorry. "Hadn't seen her for quite a long time, I suppose?" "Never had seen her. I'm from the country." Something impelled Mrs. Bunting to say these words, but she hastily corrected herself. "At least I was." "Will he be there?" She looked at him dumbly, not in the least knowing to whom he was alluding. "I mean the husband," went on the inspector hastily. "I felt sorry for the last poor chap. I mean the husband of the last one. He seemed so awfully miserable. You see, she'd been a good wife and a good mother till she took to the drink." "It always is so," breathed out Mrs. Bunting. "Aye." He waited a moment. "Do you know anything about the court?" he asked. She shook her head. "Well, don't you worry. I'll take you in along o' me. You'd never get in by yourself." They got out, and oh, the comfort of being in someone's charge, of having a determined man in uniform to look after one! And yet even now there was to Mrs. Bunting something dreamlike, unsubstantial about the whole business. "If he knew, if he only knew what I know," she kept saying over and over again to herself as she walked lightly by the big, burly form of the police inspector. "'Tisn't far, not 3 minutes," he said suddenly. "Am I walking too quick for you, ma'am?" "No, not at all. I'm a quick walker." And then suddenly they turned a corner and came on a mass of people, a densely packed crowd of men and women, staring at a mean-looking little door sunk into a high wall. "Better take my arm," the inspector suggested. "Make way there, make way!" he cried authoritatively, and he swept her through the serried ranks which parted at the sound of his voice, at the sight of his uniform. "Lucky you met me," he said, smiling. "You'd never have got through alone, and 'tain't a nice crowd, not by any manner of means." The small door opened just a little way, and they found themselves on a narrow stone-flagged path, leading into a square yard. A few men were out there, smoking. Before preceding her into the building which rose at the back of the yard, Mrs. Bunting's kind new friend took out his watch. "There's another 20 minutes before they'll begin," he said. "There's the mortuary." He pointed with his thumb to a low room built out to the right of the court. "Would you like to go in and see them?" he whispered. "Oh, no!" she cried in a tone of extreme horror. And he looked down at her with sympathy, and with increased respect. She was a nice, respectable woman, she was. She had not come here imbued with any morbid, horrible curiosity, but because she thought it her duty to do so. He suspected her of being sister-in-law to one of the Avenger's victims. They walked through into a big room or hall, now full of men talking in subdued yet eager, animated tones. "I think you'd better sit down here," he said considerately, and leading her to one of the benches that stood out from the whitewashed walls, "unless you'd rather be with the witnesses, that is." But again she said, "Oh, no," and then with an effort, "Oughtn't I to go into the court now, if it's likely to be so full?" "Don't you worry," he said kindly. "I'll see you get a proper place. I must leave you now for a minute, but I'll come back in good time and look after you." She raised a thick veil she had pulled down over her face while they were going through that sinister, wolfish-looking crowd outside, and looked about her. Many of the gentlemen, they mostly wore tall hats and good overcoats, standing round and about her looked vaguely familiar. She picked out one at once. He was a famous journalist, whose shrewd, animated face was familiar to her owing to the fact that it was widely advertised in connection with the preparation for the hair, the preparation which in happier, more prosperous days Bunting had had great faith in, and used, or so he always said, with great benefit to himself. This gentleman was the centre of an eager circle. Half a dozen men were talking to him, listening deferentially when he spoke, and each of these men, so Mrs. Bunting realized, was a somebody. How strange, how amazing, to reflect that from all parts of London, from their doubtless important avocations, one unseen, mysterious beckoner had brought all these men here together, to this sordid place on this bitterly cold, dreary day. Here they were, all thinking of, talking of, evoking one unknown, mysterious personality, that of the shadowy and yet terribly real human being who chose to call himself the Avenger. And somewhere, not so very far away from them all, the Avenger was keeping these clever, astute, highly trained minds, aye, and bodies too, at bay. Even Mrs. Bunting, sitting here unnoticed, realized the irony of her presence among them. End of Chapter 18. Chapter 19. It seemed to Mrs. Bunting that she had been sitting there a long time. It was really about a quarter of an hour, when her official friend came back. "Better come along now," he whispered. "It'll begin soon." She followed him out into a passage, up a row of steep stone steps, and so into the coroner's court. The court was big, well-lighted room, in some ways not unlike a chapel, the more so that a kind of gallery ran halfway round, a gallery evidently set aside for the general public, for it was now crammed to its utmost capacity. Mrs. Bunting glanced timidly towards the serried row of faces. Had it not been for her good fortune in meeting the man she was now following, it was there that she would have had to try and make her way. And she would have failed. Those people had rushed in the moment the doors were opened, pushing, fighting their way in a way she could never have pushed or fought. There were just a few women among them, set, determined-looking women, belonging to every class, but made one by their love of sensation and their power of forcing their way in where they wanted to be. But the women were few. The great majority of those standing there were men, men who were also representative of every class of Londoner. The centre of the court was like an arena. It was sunk 2 or 3 steps below the surrounding gallery. Just now it was comparatively clear of people, save for the benches on which sat the men who were to compose the jury. Some way from these men, huddled together in a kind of big pew, stood 7 people, 3 women and 4 men. "Do you see the witnesses?" whispered the inspector, pointing these out to her. He supposed her to know one of them with familiar knowledge, but, if that were so, she made no sign. Between the windows, facing the whole room, was a kind of little platform, on which stood a desk and an armchair. Mrs. Bunting guessed rightly that it was there the coroner would sit. And to the left of the platform was the witness stand, also raised considerably above the jury. Amazingly different, and far, far more grim and awe-inspiring than the scene of the inquest which had taken place so long ago, on that bright April day, in the village inn. There the coroner had sat on the same level as the jury, and the witnesses had simply stepped forward one by one and taken their place before him. Looking round her fearfully, Mrs. Bunting thought she would surely die if ever she were exposed to the ordeal of standing in that curious box-like stand, and she stared across at the bench where sat the 7 witnesses with a feeling of sincere pity in her heart. But even she soon realized that her pity was wasted. Each woman witness looked eager, excited, and animated, well pleased to be the centre of attention and attraction to the general public. It was plain each was enjoying her part of important, if humble, actress in the thrilling drama which was now absorbing the attention of all London. It might almost be said of the whole world. Looking at these women, Mrs. Bunting wondered vaguely which was which. Was it that rather draggle-tailed-looking young person who had certainly, or almost certainly, seen the Avenger within 10 seconds of the double crime being committed? The woman who, aroused by one of his victims' cry of terror, had rushed to her window and seen the murderer's shadowy form pass swiftly by in the fog? Yet another woman, so Mrs. Bunting now remembered, had given a most circumstantial account of what the avenger looked like, for he, it was supposed, had actually brushed by her as he passed. Those two women now before her had been interrogated and cross-examined again and again, not only by the police, but by representatives of every newspaper in London. It was from what they had both said, unluckily their accounts materially differed, that official description of the avenger had been worked up, that which described him as being a good-looking, respectable young fellow of 28, carrying a newspaper parcel. As for the third woman, she was doubtless an acquaintance, a boon companion of the dead. Mrs. Bunting looked away from the witnesses and focused her gaze on another unfamiliar sight. Specially prominent, running indeed through the whole length of the shut-in space, that is, from the coroner's high dais right across to the opening in the wooden barrier, was an ink-splashed table at which, when she had first taken her place, there had been sitting 3 men busily sketching. But now every seat at the table was occupied by tired, intelligent-looking men, each with a notebook, or with some loose sheets of paper, before him. "Them's the reporters," whispered her friend. "They don't like coming till the last minute, for they has to be the last to go. At an ordinary inquest there are only 2, maybe 3, attending, but now every paper in the kingdom has pretty well applied for a pass to that reporter's table." He looked consideringly down into the well of the court. "Now let me see what I can do for you." Then he beckoned to the coroner's officer. "Perhaps you could put this lady just over there, in a corner by herself? Related to a relation of the deceased, but doesn't want to be—" He whispered a word or two, and the other nodded sympathetically and looked at Mrs. Bunting with interest. "I'll put her just here," he muttered. "There's no one coming there to-day. You see, there are only 7 witnesses. Sometimes we have a lot more than that." And he kindly put her on a now empty bench opposite to where the 7 witnesses stood and sat with their eager, set faces, ready, aye, more than ready, to play their part. For a moment every eye in the court was focused on Mrs. Bunting, but soon those who had stared so hungrily, so intently at her, realized that she had nothing to do with the case. She was evidently there as a spectator, and, more fortunate than most, she had a "friend at court," and so was able to sit comfortably instead of having to stand in the crowd. But she was not long left in isolation. Very soon some of the important-looking gentlemen she had seen downstairs came into the court, and were ushered over to her seat while 2 or 3 among them, including the famous writer whose face was so familiar that it almost seemed to Mrs. Bunting like that of a kindly acquaintance, were accommodated at the reporter's table. "Gentlemen, the coroner." The jury stood up, shuffling their feet, and then sat down again. Over the spectators there fell a sudden silence. And then what immediately followed recalled to Mrs. Bunting, for the first time, that informal little country inquest of long ago. First came the "Oyez! Oyez!" the old Norman French summons to all whose business it is to attend a solemn inquiry into the death, sudden, unexplained, terrible, of a fellow being. The jury, there were 14 of them, all stood up again. They raised their hands and solemnly chanted together the curious words of their oath. Then came a quick, informal exchange of sentences twixt the coroner and his officer. Yes, everything was in order. The jury had viewed the bodies. He quickly corrected himself. The body, for technically speaking the inquest just about to be held only concerned one body. And then, amid a silence so absolute that the slightest rustle could be heard through the court, the coroner, a clever-looking gentleman, though not so old as Mrs. Bunting thought he ought to have been to occupy so important a position on so important a day, gave a little history, as it were, of the terrible and mysterious Avenger crimes. He spoke very clearly, warming to his work as he went on. He told them that he had been present at the inquest held on one of the Avenger's former victims. "I only went through professional curiosity," he threw in by way of parenthesis, "little thinking, gentlemen, that the inquest on one of these unhappy creatures would ever be held in my court." On and on he went, though he had in truth but little to say, and though that little was known to every one of his listeners. Mrs. Bunting heard one of the older gentlemen sitting near her whisper to another, "Drawing it out all he can, that's what he's doing, having the time of his life, evidently." And then the other whispered back, so low that she could only just catch the words, Aye, but he's a good chap. I knew his father. We were at school together. Takes his job very seriously, you know. He does to-day, at any rate." She was listening intently, waiting for a word, a sentence, which would relieve her hidden terrors, or, on the other hand, confirm them. But the word, the sentence, was never uttered. And yet, at the very end of his long peroration, the coroner did throw out a hint which might mean anything, or nothing. "I am glad to say that we hope to obtain such evidence to-day as will in time lead to the apprehension of the miscreant who has committed, and is still committing, these terrible crimes." Mrs. Bunting stared uneasily up into the coroner's firm, determined-looking face. What did he mean by that? Was there any new evidence? Evidence of which Joe Chandler, for instance, was ignorant? And, as if in answer to the unspoken question, her heart gave a sudden leap, for a big, burly man had taken his place in the witness box, a policeman who had not been sitting with the other witnesses. But soon her uneasy terror became stilled. This witness was simply the constable who had found the first body. In quick, business-like tones he described exactly what had happened to him on that cold, foggy morning 10 days ago. He was shown a plan, and he marked it slowly, carefully, with a thick finger. That was the exact place— No, he was making a mistake. That was the place where the other body had lain. He explained apologetically that he had got rather mixed up between the two bodies, that of Johanna Cobbett and Sophie Hurtle. And then the coroner intervened authoritatively. "For the purpose of this inquiry," he said, "we must, I think, for a moment consider the two murders together." After that the witness went on far more comfortably, and as he proceeded, in a quick monotone, the full and deadly horror of the avenger's acts came over Mrs. Bunting in a great seething flood of sick fear and yes, remorse. Up to now she had given very little thought, if indeed any thought, to the drink-sodden victims of the avenger. It was he who had filled her thoughts, he and those who were trying to track him down. But now? Now she felt sick and sorry she had come here today. She wondered if she would ever be able to get the vision the policeman's words had conjured up out of her mind, out of her memory. And then there came an eager stir of excitement and of attention throughout the whole court, for the policeman had stepped down out of the witness box, and one of the women witnesses was being conducted to his place. Mrs. Bunting looked with interest and sympathy at the woman, remembering how she herself had trembled with fear, trembled as that poor, bedraggled, common-looking person was trembling now. The woman had looked so cheerful, so well pleased with herself till a minute ago, but now she had become very pale, and she looked round her as a hunted animal might have done. But the coroner was very kind, very soothing and gentle in his manner, just as that other coroner had been when dealing with Ellen Green at the inquest on that poor drowned girl. After the witness had repeated in a toneless voice the solemn words of the oath, she began to be taken, step by step, through her story. At once Mrs. Bunting realized that this was the woman who claimed to have seen the avenger from her bedroom window. Gaining confidence as she went on, the witness described how she had heard a long-drawn, stifled screech, and, aroused from deep sleep, had instinctively jumped out of bed and rushed to her window. The coroner looked down at something lying on his desk. "Let me see. Here is the plan. Yes, I think I understand that the house in which you are lodging exactly faces the alley where the two crimes were committed?" And there arose a quick, futile discussion. The house did not face the alley, but the window of the witness's bedroom faced the alley. "A distinction without a difference," said the coroner testily. "And now tell us as clearly and as quickly as you can what you saw when you looked out." There fell a dead silence on the crowded court, and then the woman broke out, speaking more volubly and firmly than she had yet done. "I saw him!" she cried. "I shall never forget it. No, not till my dying day!" And she looked round defiantly. Mrs. Bunting suddenly remembered a chat one of the newspaper men had had with a person who slept under this woman's room. That person had unkindly said she felt sure that Lizzie Cole had not got up that night, that she had made up the whole story. She, the speaker, slept lightly, and that night had been tending a sick child. Accordingly, she would have heard if there had been either the scream described by Lizzie Cole, or the sound of Lizzie Cole jumping out of bed. "We quite understand that you think you saw The coroner hesitated. "The individual who had just perpetrated these terrible crimes. But what we want to have from you is a description of him. In spite of the foggy atmosphere about which all are agreed, you say you saw him distinctly, walking along for some yards below your window. Now, please, try and tell us what he was like." The woman began twisting and untwisting the corner of a colored handkerchief she held in her hand. "Let us begin at the beginning," said the coroner patiently. "What sort of a hat was this man wearing when you saw him hurrying from the passage?" "It was just a black 'at," said the witness at last in a husky, rather anxious tone. "Yes, just a black hat. And a coat. Were you able to see what sort of a coat he was wearing?" "'E 'adn't got no coat," she said decidedly. "No coat at all. I remembers that very particularly. I thought it queer as it was so cold. Everybody as can wears some sort of coat this weather." A juryman who had been looking at a strip of newspaper and apparently not attending at all to what the witness was saying, here jumped up and put out his hand. "Yes," the coroner turned to him. "I just want to say that this 'ere witness, if her name is Lizzie Cole, began by saying the Avenger was wearing a coat. A big, heavy coat. I've got it here, in this bit of paper." "I never said so!" cried the woman passionately. "I was made to say all those things by the young man what came to me from the Evening Sun. Just put in what he liked in his paper, he did, not what I said at all." At this there was some laughter, quickly suppressed. "In future," said the coroner severely, addressing the juryman, who had now sat down again, "you must ask any question you wish to ask through your foreman, and please wait till I have concluded my examination of the witness." But this interruption, this accusation, had utterly upset the witness. She began contradicting herself hopelessly. The man she had seen hurrying by in the semi-darkness below was tall. No, he was short. He was thin. No, he was a stoutish young man. And as to whether he was carrying anything, there was quite an acrimonious discussion. Most positively, most confidently, the witness declared that she had seen a newspaper parcel under his arm. It had bulged out at the back, so she declared. But it was proved, very gently and firmly, that she had said nothing of the kind to the gentleman from Scotland Yard who had taken down her first account. In fact, to him she had declared confidently that the man had carried nothing, nothing at all, that she had seen his arms swinging up and down. One fact, if fact it could be called, the coroner did elicit. Lizzie Cole suddenly volunteered the statement that as he had passed her window he had looked up at her. This was quite a new statement. "He looked up at you," repeated the coroner. "You said nothing of that in your examination." "I said nothink because I was scared, nigh scared to death." "If you could really see his countenance, for we know the night was dark and foggy, will you please tell me what he was like?" But the coroner was speaking casually, his hand straying over his desk. Not a creature in that court now believed the woman's story. "Dark," she answered dramatically. "Dark, almost black, if you can take my meaning, with a sort of nigger look." And then there was a titter. Even the jury smiled, and sharply the coroner bade Lizzie Cole stand down. Far more credence was given to the evidence of the next witness. This was an older, quieter-looking woman, decently dressed in black. Being the wife of a night watchman whose work lay in a big warehouse situated about 100 yards from the alley or passage where the crimes had taken place, she had gone out to take her husband some food he always had at 1 in the morning. And a man had passed her, breathing hard and walking very quickly. Her attention had been drawn to him because she very seldom met anyone at that hour, and because he had such an odd, peculiar look and manner. Mrs. Bunting, listening attentively, realized that it was very much from what this witness had said that the official description of the Avenger had been composed, that description which had brought such comfort to her, Ellen Bunting's, soul. This witness spoke quietly, confidently, and her account of the newspaper parcel the man was carrying was perfectly clear and positive. It was a neat parcel, she said, done up with string. She had thought it an odd thing for a respectably dressed young man to carry such a parcel. That was what had made her notice it. But when pressed, she had to admit that it had been a very foggy night. so foggy that she herself had been afraid of losing her way, though every step was familiar. When the third woman went into the box, and with sighs and tears told of her acquaintance with one of the deceased, with Johanna Cobbett, there was a stir of sympathetic attention. But she had nothing to say throwing any light on the investigation, save that she admitted reluctantly that Annie would have been such a nice, respectable young woman if it hadn't been for the drink. Her examination was shortened as much as possible, and so was that of the next witness, the husband of Johanna Cobbett. He was a very respectable-looking man, a foreman in a big business house at Croydon. He seemed to feel his position most acutely. He hadn't seen his wife for 2 years. He hadn't had news of her for 6 months. Before she took to drink she had been an admirable wife, and, yes, mother. Yet another painful few minutes to anyone who had a heart or imagination to understand was spent when the father of the murdered woman was in the box. He had had later news of his unfortunate daughter than her husband had had, but of course he could throw no light at all on her murder or murderer. A barman who had served both the women with drink just before the public-house closed for the night was handled rather roughly. He had stepped with a jaunty air into the box, and came out of it looking cast down, uneasy. And then there took place a very dramatic, because an utterly unexpected, incident. It was one of which the evening papers made the utmost, much to Mrs. Bunting's indignation, but neither coroner nor jury, and they, after all, were the people who mattered, thought a great deal of it. There had come a pause in the proceedings. All 7 witnesses had been heard, and a gentleman near Mrs. Bunting whispered, "They are now going to call Dr. Gaunt. He's been in every big murder case for the last 30 years. He's sure to have something interesting to say. It was really to hear him I came." But before Dr. Gaunt had time even to get up from the seat with which he had been accommodated close to the coroner, there came a stir among the general public, or rather among those spectators who stood near the low wooden door which separated the official part of the court from the gallery. The coroner's officer, with an apologetic air, approached the coroner and handed him up an envelope. And again, in an instant, there fell absolute silence on the court. Looking rather annoyed, the coroner opened the envelope. He glanced down the sheet of notepaper it contained. Then he looked up. Then he glanced down again. Mr. Is it cannot?" he said doubtfully, "may come forward." There ran a titter through the spectators, and the coroner frowned. A neat, jaunty-looking old gentleman, in a nice fur-lined overcoat, with a fresh red face and white side whiskers, was conducted from the place where he had been standing among the general public to the witness box. "This is somewhat out of order, Mr. Cannot," said the coroner severely. "You should have sent me this note before the proceedings began. This gentleman," he said, addressing the jury, "informs me that he has something of the utmost importance to reveal in connection with our investigation." "I have remained silent, I have locked what I knew within my own breast," began Mr. Cannot in a quavering voice, "because I am so afraid of the press. I knew if I said anything, even to the police, that my house would be besieged by reporters and newspaper men. I have a delicate wife, Mr. Coroner. Such a state of things, the state of things I imagine, might cause her death. Indeed, I hope she will never read a report of these proceedings. Fortunately, she has an excellent trained nurse. You will now take the oath," said the coroner sharply. He already regretted having allowed this absurd person to have his say. Mr. Cannot took the oath with a gravity and decorum which had been lacking in most of those who had preceded him. "I will address myself to the jury," he began. "You will do nothing of the sort," broke in the coroner. "Now please attend to me. You assert in your letter that you know who is the avenger," put in Mr. Cannot promptly. "The perpetrator of these crimes. You further declare that you met him on the very night he committed the murder we are now investigating?" "I do so declare," said Mr. Cannot confidently. "Though in the best of health myself," he beamed round the court, a now amused, attentive court, "it is my fate to be surrounded by sick people, to have only ailing friends. I have to trouble you with my private affairs, Mr. Coroner, in order to explain why I happen to be out at so undue an hour as 1 o'clock in the morning." Again a titter ran through the court. Even the jury broke into broad smiles. "Yes," went on the witness solemnly, I was with a sick friend, in fact, I may say a dying friend, for since then he has passed away. I will not reveal my exact dwelling place. You, sir, have it on my note paper. It is not necessary to reveal it, but you will understand me when I say that in order to come home I had to pass through a portion of the Regent's Park, and it was there, to be exact, about the middle of Prince's Terrace, when a very peculiar-looking individual stopped and accosted me." Mrs. Bunting's hand shot up to her breast. A feeling of deadly fear took possession of her. "I mustn't faint," she said to herself hurriedly. "I mustn't faint. Whatever's the matter with me?" She took out her bottle of smelling salts and gave it a good long sniff. He was a grim, gaunt man, was this stranger, Mr. Coroner, with a very odd-looking face. I should say an educated man. In common parlance, a gentleman. What drew my special attention to him was that he was talking aloud to himself. In fact, he seemed to be repeating poetry. I give you my word, I had no thought of the Avenger, no thought at all. To tell you the truth, I thought this gentleman was a poor escaped lunatic, a man who'd got away from his keeper. The Regent's Park, sir, as I need hardly tell you, is a most quiet and soothing neighborhood." And then a member of the general public gave a loud guffaw. "I appeal to you, sir," the old gentleman suddenly cried out, "to protect me from this unseemly levity. I have not come here with any other object than that of doing my duty as a citizen." "I must ask you to keep to what is strictly relevant," said the coroner stiffly. "Time is going on, and I have another important witness to call, a medical witness. Kindly tell me as shortly as possible what made you suppose that this stranger could possibly be—" With an effort he brought out for the first time since the proceedings began the words, "the Avenger." "I am coming to that," said Mr. Cannot hastily. "I am coming to that. Bear with me a little longer, Mr. Coroner. It was a foggy night, but not as foggy as it became later. And just when we were passing one another, I and this man, who was talking aloud to himself, he, instead of going on, stopped and turned towards me. That made me feel queer and uncomfortable, the more so that there was a very wild, mad look on his face. I said to him as soothingly as possible, 'A very foggy night, sir,' and he said, 'Yes, yes, it is a foggy night, a night fit for the commission of dark and salutary deeds.' A very strange phrase, sir, that, 'dark and salutary deeds.'" He looked at the coroner expectantly. "Well? Well, Mr. Cannot? Was that all? Did you see this person go off in the direction of King's Cross, for instance?" "No." Mr. Cannot reluctantly shook his head. "No, I must honestly say I did not. He walked along a certain way by my side, and then he crossed the road and was lost in the fog." "That will do," said the coroner. He spoke more kindly. "I thank you, Mr. Cannot, for coming here and giving us what you evidently consider important information." Mr. Cannot bowed, a funny, little old-fashioned bow, and again some of those present tittered rather foolishly. As he was stepping down from the witness box, he turned and looked up at the coroner, opening his lips as he did so. There was a murmur of talking going on, but Mrs. Bunting, at any rate, heard quite distinctly what it was that he said. "One thing I have forgotten, sir, which may be of importance. The man carried a bag, a rather light-colored leather bag, in his left hand. It was such a bag, sir, as might well contain a long-handled knife." Mrs. Bunting looked at the reporter's table. She remembered suddenly that she had told Bunting about the disappearance of Mr. Sleuth's bag. And then a feeling of intense thankfulness came over her. Not a single reporter at the long, ink-stained table had put down that last remark of Mr. Cannot. In fact, not one of them had heard it. Again the last witness put up his hand to command attention, and then silence did fall on the court. "One word more," he said in a quavering voice. "May I ask to be accommodated with a seat for the rest of the proceedings? I see there is some room left on the witnesses' bench." And without waiting for permission, he nimbly stepped across and sat down. Mrs. Bunting looked up, startled. Her friend the inspector was bending over her. "Perhaps you'd like to come along now," he said urgently. "I don't suppose you want to hear the medical evidence. It's always painful for a female to hear that. And there'll be an awful rush when the inquest's over. I could get you away quietly now." She rose, and pulling her veil down over her pale face, followed him obediently. Down the stone staircase they went, and through the big, now empty, room downstairs. "I'll let you out the back way," he said. "I expect you're tired, ma'am, and will like to get home to a cup of tea." "I don't know how to thank you." There were tears in her eyes. She was trembling with excitement and emotion. "You have been good to me." "Oh, that's nothing," he said a little awkwardly. "I expect you went through a pretty bad time, didn't you?" "Will they be having that old gentleman again?" She spoke in a whisper, and looked up at him with a pleading, agonized look. "Good Lord, no. Crazy old fool. We're troubled with a lot of those sort of people, you know, ma'am, and they often do have funny names, too. You see, that sort is busy all their lives in the city, or what not. Then they retires when they gets about 60, and they're fit to hang themselves with dullness. Why, there's hundreds of loonies of the sort to be met in London. You can't go about at night and not meet 'em. Plenty of 'em." "Then you don't think there was anything in what he said?" she ventured. "In what that old gent said? Goodness, no," he laughed good-naturedly. "But I'll tell you what I do think. If it wasn't for the time that had gone by, I should believe that the second witness had seen that crafty devil." He lowered his voice. "But there, Dr. Gaunt declares most positively, so did 2 other medical gentlemen, that the poor creatures had been dead hours when they were found." Medical gentlemen are always very positive about their evidence. They have to be, otherwise who'd believe 'em? If we'd time I could tell you of a case in which, well, 'twas all because of Dr. Gaunt that the murderer escaped. We all knew perfectly well the man we caught did it, but he was able to prove an alibi as to the time Dr. Gaunt said the poor soul was killed. End of Chapter 19. Chapter 20. It was not late even now, for the inquest had begun very punctually, but Mrs. Bunting felt that no power on earth should force her to go to Ealing. She felt quite tired out, and as if she could think of nothing. Pacing along very slowly, as if she were an old, old woman, she began listlessly turning her steps towards home. Somehow she felt that it would do her more good to stay out in the air than take the train. Also, she would thus put off the moment to which she looked forward with dread and dislike, when she would have to invent a circumstantial story as to what she had said to the doctor and what the doctor had said to her. Like most men and women of his class, Bunting took a great interest in other people's ailments, the more interest that he was himself so remarkably healthy. He would feel quite injured if Ellen didn't tell him everything that had happened. Everything, that is, that the doctor had told her. As she walked swiftly along, at every corner, or so it seemed to her, and outside every public house, stood eager boys selling the latest edition of the afternoon papers to equally eager buyers. "Avenger inquest!" they shouted exultantly. "All the latest evidence!" At one place, where there were a row of contents bills pinned to the pavement by stones, she stopped and looked down. "Opening of the Avenger inquest. What is he really like? Full description." On yet another ran the ironic query, "Avenger inquest. Do you know him?" And as that facetious question stared up at her in huge print, Mrs. Bunting turned sick. So sick and faint that she did what she had never done before in her life. She pushed her way into a public house, and putting 2 pennies down on the counter, asked for and received a glass of cold water. As she walked along the now gaslit streets she found her mind dwelling persistently, not on the inquest at which she had been present, not even on the Avenger, but on his victims. Shudderingly she visualized the 2 cold bodies lying in the mortuary. She seemed also to see that third body, which, though cold, must yet be warmer than the other 2, for at this time yesterday the Avenger's last victim had been alive, poor soul. Alive, and, according to a companion of hers whom the papers had already interviewed, particularly merry and bright. Hitherto Mrs. Bunting had been spared in any real sense a vision of the Avenger's victims. Now they haunted her, and she wondered wearily if this fresh horror was to be added to the terrible fear which encompassed her night and day. As she came within sight of home, her spirit suddenly lightened. The narrow, drab-coloured little house, flanked each side by others exactly like it in every single particular, save that their front yards were not so well kept, looked as if it could, aye, and would, keep any secret closely hidden. For a moment, at any rate, the Avenger's victims receded from her mind. She thought of them no more. All her thoughts were concentrated on Bunting and Mr. Sleuth. She wondered what had happened during her absence, whether the lodger had rung his bell, and if so, how he had got on with Bunting, and Bunting with him. She walked up the little flagged path wearily, and yet with a pleasant feeling of home-coming. And then she saw that Bunting must have been watching for her behind the now closely drawn curtains, for before she could either knock or ring he had opened the door. "I was getting quite anxious about you," he exclaimed. "Come in, Ellen, quick! You must be fair perished a day like now, and you out so little as you are. Well, I hope you found the doctor all right." He looked at her with affectionate anxiety. And then there came a sudden, happy thought to Mrs. Bunting. "No," she said slowly, "Dr. Evans wasn't in. I waited and waited and waited, but he never came in at all. 'Twas my own fault," she added quickly. Even at such a moment as this she told herself that though she had, in a sort of way, a kind of right to lie to her husband, she had no right to slander the doctor who had been so kind to her years ago. "I ought to have sent him a card yesterday night," she said. "Of course, I was a fool to go all that way, just on chance of finding a doctor in. It stands to reason they've got to go out to people at all times of day." "I hope they gave you a cup of tea," he said. And again she hesitated, debating a point with herself. If the doctor had a decent sort of servant, of course, she, Ellen Bunting, would have been offered a cup of tea, especially if she explained she'd known him a long time. She compromised. "I was offered some," she said in a weak, tired voice. "But there, Bunting, I didn't feel as if I wanted it. I'd be very grateful for a cup now, if you'd just make it for me over the ring." "Course I will," he said eagerly. "You just come in and sit down, my dear. Don't trouble to take your things off now. Wait till you've had tea." And she obeyed him. "Where's Daisy?" she asked suddenly. "I thought the girl would be back by the time I got home." "She ain't coming home today." There was an odd, sly, smiling look on Bunting's face. "Did she send a telegram?" asked Mrs. Bunting. "No. Young Chandler's just come in and told me. He's been over there and—would you believe it, Ellen, he's managed to make friends with Margaret. Wonderful what love will do, ain't it? He went over there just to help Daisy carry her bag back, you know, and then Margaret told him that her lady had sent her some money to go to the play, and she actually asked Joe to go with them this evening, she and Daisy, to the pantomime. Did you ever hear of such a thing?" "Very nice for them, I'm sure," said Mrs. Bunting absently. But she was pleased to have her mind taken off herself. "Then when is that girl coming home?" she asked patiently. "Well, it appears that Chandler's got tomorrow morning off too, this evening and tomorrow morning. He'll be on duty all night, but he proposes to go over and bring Daisy back in time for early dinner. Will that suit you, Ellen?" "Yes, that'll be all right," she said. "I don't grudge the girl her bit of pleasure. One's only young once. By the way, did the lodger ring while I was out?" Bunting turned round from the gas ring, which he was watching to see the kettle boil. "No," he said. "Come to think of it, it's rather a funny thing, but the truth is, Ellen, I never gave Mr. Sleuth a thought. You see, Chandler came in and was telling me all about Margaret, laughing like, and then something else happened while you was out, Ellen." "Something else happened?" she said in a startled voice. Getting up from her chair, she came towards her husband. "What happened? Who came?" "Just a message for me, asking if I could go tonight to wait at a young lady's birthday party. In Hanover Terrace it is. A waiter, one of them nasty Swiss fellows as works for nothing, fell out just at the last minute, and so they had to send for me." His honest face shone with triumph. The man who had taken over his old friend's business in Baker Street had hitherto behaved very badly to Bunting, and that though Bunting had been on the books for ever so long, and had always given every satisfaction. But this new man had never employed him, no, not once. "I hope you didn't make yourself too cheap," said his wife jealously. "No, that I didn't. I hummed and hawed a lot, and I could see the fellow was quite worried, In fact, at the end he offered me half a crown more, so I graciously consented." Husband and wife laughed more merrily than they had done for a long time. "You won't mind being alone here? I don't count the lodger. He's no good." Bunting looked at her anxiously. He was only prompted to ask the question because lately Ellen had been so queer, so unlike herself. Otherwise it never would have occurred to him that she could be afraid of being alone in the house. She had often been so in the days when he got more jobs. She stared at him, a little suspiciously. "I be afraid?" she echoed. "Certainly not. Why should I be? I've never been afraid before. What do you exactly mean by that, Bunting?" "Oh, nothing. I only thought you might feel funny like, all alone on this ground floor. You was so upset yesterday when that young fool Chandler came, dressed up, to the door." "I shouldn't have been frightened if he'd just been an ordinary stranger," she said shortly. "He said something silly to me, just in keeping with his character like, and it upset me. Besides, I feel better now." As she was sipping gratefully her cup of tea, there came a noise outside, the shouts of newspaper sellers. "I'll just run out," said Bunting apologetically, "and see what happened at that inquest today. Besides, they may have a clue about the horrible affair last night. Chandler was full of it, when he wasn't talking about Daisy and Margaret, that is. He's on tonight, luckily not till 12 o'clock, plenty of time to escort the two of 'em back after the play. Besides, he said he'll put them into a cab and blow the expense if the panto goes on too long for him to take 'em home." "On tonight?" repeated Mrs. Bunting. "Whatever for?" "Well, you see, the Avengers always done 'em in couples, so to speak. They've got an idea that he'll have a try again tonight. However, even so, Joe's only on from midnight till 5 o'clock. Then he'll go and turn in a bit before going off to fetch Daisy. Fine thing to be young, ain't it, Ellen?" "I can't believe that he'd go out on such a night as this." "What do you mean?" said Bunting, staring at her. Ellen had spoken so oddly, as if to herself, and in so fierce and passionate a tone. "What do I mean?" she repeated, and a great fear clutched at her heart. What had she said? She had been thinking aloud. "Why, by saying he won't go out. Of course he has to go out. Besides, he'll have been to the play as it is. 'Twould be a pretty thing if the police didn't go out just because it was cold." I was thinking of the Avenger," said Mrs. Bunting. She looked at her husband fixedly. Somehow she had felt impelled to utter those true words. "He don't take no heed of heat nor cold," said Bunting somberly. "I take it the man's dead to all human feeling, saving, of course, revenge." "So that's your idea about him, is it?" She looked across at her husband. Somehow this dangerous, this perilous conversation between them attracted her strangely. She felt as if she must go on with it. "Do you think he was the man that woman said she saw? That young man what passed her with a newspaper parcel?" "Let me see," he said slowly. "I thought that 'twas from the bedroom window a woman saw him?" "No, no, I mean the other woman, what was taking her husband's breakfast to him in the warehouse. She was far the most respectable-looking woman of the two," said Mrs. Bunting impatiently. And then, seeing her husband's look of utter blank astonishment, she felt a thrill of unreasoning terror. She must have gone suddenly mad to have said what she did. Hurriedly she got up from her chair. "There now," she said. "Here I am gossiping all about nothing when I ought to be seeing about the lodger's supper. It was someone in the train talked to me about that person as thinks she saw the Avenger." Without waiting for an answer she went into her bedroom, lit the gas, and shut the door. A moment later she heard Bunting go out to buy the paper they had both forgotten during their dangerous discussion. As she slowly, languidly took off her nice, warm coat and shawl, Mrs. Bunting found herself shivering. It was dreadfully cold, quite unnaturally cold even for the time of year. She looked longingly towards the fireplace. It was now concealed by the wash-hand stand, but how pleasant it would be to drag that stand aside and light a bit of fire, especially as Bunting was going to be out tonight. He would have to put on his dress clothes, and she didn't like his dressing in the sitting-room. It didn't suit her ideas that he should do so. How if she did light the fire here, in their bedroom? It would be nice for her to have a bit of fire to cheer her up after he had gone. Mrs. Bunting knew only too well that she would have very little sleep the coming night. She looked over with shuddering distaste at her nice soft bed. There she would lie, on that couch of little ease, listening, listening. She went down to the kitchen. Everything was ready for Mr. Sleuth's supper, for she had made all her preparations before going out so as not to have to hurry back before it suited her to do so. Leaning the tray for a moment on the top of the banisters, she listened. Even in that nice warm drawing-room, and with a good fire, how cold the lodger must feel sitting studying at the table! But unwonted sounds were coming through the door. Mr. Sleuth was moving restlessly about the room, not sitting reading, as was his wont at this time of the evening. She knocked, and then waited a moment. There came the sound of a sharp click, that of the key turning in the lock of the chiffonier cupboard, or so Mr. Sleuth's landlady could have sworn. There was a pause. She knocked again. "Come in," said Mr. Sleuth loudly, and she opened the door and carried in the tray. "You are a little earlier than usual, are you not, Mrs. Bunting?" he said, with a touch of irritation in his voice. "I don't think so, sir, but I've been out. Perhaps I lost count of the time. I thought you'd like your breakfast early, as you had dinner rather sooner than usual." "Breakfast? Did you say breakfast, Mrs. Bunting?" "I beg your pardon, sir, I'm sure. I meant supper." He looked at her fixedly. It seemed to Mrs. Bunting that there was a terrible questioning look in his dark sunken eyes. "Aren't you well?" he said slowly. "You don't look well, Mrs. Bunting." "No, sir," she said, "I'm not well. I went over to see a doctor this afternoon, to Ealing, sir." "I hope he did you good, Mrs. Bunting." The lodger's voice had become softer, kinder in quality. "It always does me good to see the doctor," said Mrs. Bunting evasively. And then a very odd smile lit up Mr. Sleuth's face. "Doctors are a maligned body of men," he said. "I'm glad to hear you speak well of them. They do their best, Mrs. Bunting. Being human, they are liable to err, but I assure you they do their best." "That I'm sure they do, sir." She spoke heartily, sincerely. Doctors had always treated her most kindly, and even generously. And then, having laid the cloth and put the lodger's one hot dish upon it, she went towards the door. "Wouldn't you like me to bring up another scuttleful of coals, sir? It's bitterly cold, getting colder every minute. A fearful night to have to go out in." She looked at him deprecatingly. And then Mr. Sleuth did something which startled her very much. Pushing his chair back, he jumped up and drew himself to his full height. "What do you mean?" he stammered. "Why did you say that, Mrs. Bunting?" She stared at him, fascinated, affrighted. Again there came an awful questioning look over his face. "I was thinking of Bunting, sir. He's got a job tonight. He's going to act as waiter at a young lady's birthday party. I was thinking it's a pity he has to turn out, and in his thin clothes, too." She brought out her words jerkily. Mr. Sleuth seemed somewhat reassured, and again he sat down. "Ah," he said. "Dear me, I'm sorry to hear that. I hope your husband will not catch cold, Mrs. Bunting." And then she shut the door, and went downstairs. Without telling Bunting what she meant to do, she dragged the heavy wash-hand stand away from the chimney-piece and lighted the fire. Then in some triumph she called Bunting in. "Time for you to dress," she cried out cheerfully, "and I've got a little bit of fire for you to dress by." As he exclaimed at her extravagance, "Well, 'twill be pleasant for me, too. Keep me company like while you're out, and make the room nice and warm when you come in. You'll be fair perished, even walking that short way," she said. And then, while her husband was dressing, Mrs. Bunting went upstairs and cleared away Mr. Sleuth's supper. The lodger said no word while she was so engaged, no word at all. He was sitting away from the table, rather an unusual thing for him to do, and staring into the fire, his hands on his knees. Mr. Sleuth looked lonely, very, very lonely and forlorn. Somehow a great rush of pity, as well as of horror, came over Mrs. Bunting's heart. He was such a, she searched for a word in her mind, but could only find the word gentle. He was such a nice, gentle gentleman, was Mr. Sleuth. Lately he had again taken to leaving his money about, as he had done the first day or two, and with some concern his landlady had seen that the store had diminished a good deal. A very simple calculation had made her realize that almost the whole of that missing money had come her way, or at any rate had passed through her hands. Mr. Sleuth never stinted himself as to food, or stinted them, his landlord and his landlady, as to what he had said he would pay. And Mrs. Bunting's conscience pricked her a little, for he hardly ever used that room upstairs, that room for which he had paid extra so generously. If Bunting got another job or two through that nasty man in Baker Street, and now that the ice had been broken between them it was very probable that he would do so, for he was a very well-trained, experienced waiter, then she thought she would tell Mr. Sleuth that she no longer wanted him to pay as much as he was now doing. She looked anxiously, deprecatingly at his long, bent back. "Good night, sir," she said at last. Mr. Sleuth turned round. His face looked sad and worn. "I hope you'll sleep well, sir." "Yes, I'm sure I shall sleep well. But perhaps I shall take a little turn first. Such is my way, Mrs. Bunting. After I have been studying all day I require a little exercise." "Oh, I wouldn't go out tonight," she said deprecatingly. "'Tisn't fit for anyone to be out in the bitter cold." And yet, he looked at her attentively, there will probably be many people out in the streets tonight. "A many more than usual, I fear, sir." "Indeed," said Mr. Sleuth quickly. "Is it not a strange thing, Mrs. Bunting, that people who have all day in which to amuse themselves should carry their revels far into the night?" "Oh, I wasn't thinking of revellers, sir. I was thinking—" She hesitated. Then, with a gasping effort, Mrs. Bunting brought out the words, "of the police." "The police?" He put up his right hand and stroked his chin 2 or 3 times with a nervous gesture. "But what is man, what is man's puny power or strength against that of God, or even of those over whose feet God has set a guard?" Mr. Sleuth looked at his landlady with a kind of triumph lighting up his face, and Mrs. Bunting felt a shuddering sense of relief. Then she had not offended her lodger? She had not made him angry by that. Was it a hint she had meant to convey to him? "Very true, sir," she said respectfully. "But Providence means us to take care of ourselves, too." And then she closed the door behind her and went downstairs. But Mr. Sleuth's landlady did not go on, down to the kitchen. She came into her sitting room, and, careless of what Bunting would think the next morning, put the tray with the remains of the lodger's meal on her table. Having done that, and having turned out the gas in the passage and the sitting room, she went into her bedroom and closed the door. The fire was burning brightly and clearly. She told herself that she did not need any other light to undress by. What was it made the flames of the fire shoot up, shoot down in that queer way? But watching it for a while, she did at last doze off a bit. And then Mrs. Bunting awoke with a sudden thumping of her heart. Woke to see that the fire was almost out. Woke to hear 11:45 chime out. Woke at last to the sound she had been listening for before she fell asleep. The sound of Mr. Sleuth, wearing his rubber-soled shoes, creeping downstairs, along the passage, and so out, very, very quietly by the front door. But once she was in bed Mrs. Bunting turned restless. She tossed this way and that, full of discomfort and unease. Perhaps it was the unaccustomed firelight dancing on the walls, making queer shadows all round her, which kept her so wide awake. She lay thinking and listening and thinking. It even occurred to her to do the one thing that might have quieted her excited brain. To get a book, one of those detective stories of which Bunting had a slender store in the next room, and then, lighting the gas, to sit up and read. No, Mrs. Bunting had always been told it was very wrong to read in bed, and she was not in a mood just now to begin doing anything that she had been told was wrong. End of Chapter 20. Chapter 21. It was a very cold night. So cold, so windy, so snow-laden was the atmosphere, that every one who could do so stayed indoors. Bunting, however, was now on his way home from what had proved a really pleasant job. A remarkable piece of luck had come his way this evening, all the more welcome because it was quite unexpected. The young lady at whose birthday party he had been present in capacity of waiter had come into a fortune that day, and she had had the gracious, the surprising thought of presenting each of the hired waiters with a sovereign. This gift, which had been accompanied by a few kind words, had gone to Bunting's heart. It had confirmed him in his conservative principles. Only gentlefolk ever behaved in that way, quiet, old-fashioned, respectable, gentlefolk, the sort of people of whom those nasty radicals know nothing and care less. But the ex-butler was not as happy as he should have been. Slackening his footsteps, he began to think with puzzled concern of how queer his wife had seemed lately. Ellen had become so nervous, so jumpy, that he didn't know what to make of her sometimes. She had never been really good-tempered, your capable, self-respecting woman seldom is, but she had never been like what she was now. And she didn't get better as the days went on. In fact, she got worse. Of late she had been quite hysterical, and for no reason at all. Take that little practical joke of young Joe Chandler. Ellen knew quite well he often had to go about in some kind of disguise, and yet how she had gone on, quite foolish-like, not at all as one would have expected her to do. There was another queer thing about her which disturbed him in more senses than one. During the last 3 weeks or so Ellen had taken to talking in her sleep. "No, no, no," she had cried out, only the night before. "It isn't true. I won't have it said. It's a lie." And there had been a wail of horrible fear and revolt in her unusually quiet, mincing voice. Phew! It was cold, and he had stupidly forgotten his gloves. He put his hands in his pockets to keep them warm, and began walking more quickly. As he tramped steadily along, the ex-butler suddenly caught sight of his lodger walking along the opposite side of the solitary street, one of those short streets leading off the broad road which encircles Regent's Park. Well, this was a funny time o' night to be taking a stroll for pleasure, like. Glancing across, Bunting noticed that Mr. Sleuth's tall, thin figure was rather bowed, and that his head was bent toward the ground. His left arm was thrust into his long Inverness cape, and so was quite hidden, but the other side of the cape bulged out, as if the lodger were carrying a bag or parcel in the hand which hung down straight. Mr. Sleuth was walking rather quickly, and as he walked he talked aloud, which, as Bunting knew, is not unusual with gentlemen who live much alone. It was clear that he had not yet become aware of the proximity of his landlord. Bunting told himself that Ellen was right. Their lodger was certainly a most eccentric, peculiar person. Strange, was it not, that that odd, loony-like gentleman should have made all the difference to his, Bunting's, and Mrs. Bunting's happiness and comfort in life? Again glancing across at Mr. Sleuth, he reminded himself, not for the first time, of this perfect lodger's one fault, his odd dislike to meat, and to what Bunting vaguely called to himself, sensible food. But there, you can't have everything, the more so that the lodger was not one of those crazy vegetarians who won't eat eggs and cheese. No, he was reasonable in this, as in everything else connected with his dealings with the Buntings. As we know, Bunting saw far less of the lodger than did his wife. Indeed, he had been upstairs only 3 or 4 times since Mr. Sleuth had been with them, and when his landlord had had occasion to wait on him, the lodger had remained silent. Indeed, their gentleman had made it very clear that he did not like either the husband or wife to come up to his rooms without being definitely asked to do so. Now, surely, would be a good opportunity for a little genial conversation. Bunting felt pleased to see his lodger. It increased his general comfortable sense of satisfaction. So it was that the butler, still an active man for his years, crossed over the road, and, stepping briskly forward, began trying to overtake Mr. Sleuth. But the more he hurried along, the more the other hastened, and that without ever turning round to see whose steps he could hear echoing behind him on the now freezing pavement. Mr. Sleuth's own footsteps were quite inaudible. An odd circumstance, when you came to think of it, as Bunting did think of it later, lying awake by Mrs. Bunting's side in the pitch darkness. What it meant, of course, was that the lodger had rubber soles on his shoes. Now Bunting had never had a pair of rubber-soled shoes sent down to him to clean. He had always supposed the lodger had only one pair of outdoor boots. The two men, the pursued and the pursuer, at last turned into the Marylebone Road. They were now within a few hundred yards of home. Plucking up courage, Bunting called out, his voice echoing freshly on the still air. "Mr. Sleuth, sir! Mr. Sleuth!" The lodger stopped and turned round. He had been walking so quickly, and he was in so poor a physical condition, that the sweat was pouring down his face. "Ah, so it's you, Mr. Bunting? I heard footsteps behind me, and I hurried on. I wish I'd known that it was you. There are so many queer characters about at night in London." "Not on a night like this, sir. Only honest folk who have business out of doors would be out such a night as this. It is cold, sir." And then into Bunting's slow and honest mind there suddenly crept the query as to what on earth Mr. Sleuth's own business out could be on this bitter night. "Cold?" the lodger repeated. He was panting a little, and his words came out sharp and quick through his thin lips. "I can't say that I find it cold, Mr. Bunting. When the snow falls, the air always becomes milder." "Yes, sir. But tonight there is such a sharp east wind. Why, it freezes the very marrow in one's bones. Still, there is nothing like walking in cold weather to make one warm, as you seem to have found, sir." Bunting noticed that Mr. Sleuth kept his distance in a rather strange way. He walked at the edge of the pavement, leaving the rest of it, on the wall side, to his landlord. "I lost my way," he said abruptly. "I've been over Primrose Hill to see a friend of mine, a man with whom I studied when I was a lad, and then, coming back, I lost my way." Now they had come right up to the little gate which opened on the shabby paved court in front of the house, that gate which now was never locked. Mr. Sleuth, pushing suddenly forward, began walking up the flagged path, when, with a "By your leave, sir," the ex-butler, stepping aside, slipped in front of his lodger in order to open the front door for him. As he passed by Mr. Sleuth, the back of Bunting's bare left hand brushed lightly against the long Inverness cape the lodger was wearing, and, to Bunting's surprise, the stretch of cloth against which his hand lay for a moment was not only damp maybe from stray flakes of snow which had settled upon it, but wet and gluey. Bunting thrust his left hand into his pocket. It was with the other that he placed the key in the lock of the door. The two men passed into the hall together. The house seemed blackly dark in comparison with the lighted-up road outside, and as he groped forward, closely followed by the lodger, there came over Bunting a sudden, reeling sensation of mortal terror, an instinctive, assailing knowledge of frightful, immediate danger. A stuffless voice, the voice of his first wife, the long-dead girl to whom his mind so seldom reverted nowadays, uttered into his ear the words, "Take care." And then the lodger spoke. His voice was harsh and grating, though not loud. "I'm afraid, Mr. Bunting, that you must have felt something dirty, foul, on my coat? It's too long a story to tell you now, but I brushed up against a dead animal, a creature to whose misery some thoughtful soul had put an end, lying across a bench on Primrose Hill." "No, sir, no, I didn't notice nothing. I scarcely touched you, sir." It seemed as if a power outside himself compelled Bunting to utter these lying words. "And now, sir, I'll be saying good night to you," he said. Stepping back, he pressed with all the strength that was in him against the wall, and let the other pass him. There was a pause, and then, "Good night," returned Mr. Sleuth, in a hollow voice. Bunting waited until the lodger had gone upstairs, and then, lighting the gas, he sat down there in the hall. Mr. Sleuth's landlord felt very queer and sick. He did not draw his left hand out of his pocket till he heard Mr. Sleuth shut the bedroom door upstairs. Then he held up his left hand and looked at it curiously. It was flecked, streaked with pale reddish blood. Taking off his boots, he crept into the room where his wife lay asleep. Stealthily he walked across to the wash-hand stand, and dipped a hand into the water jug. "Whatever are you doing? What on earth are you doing? came a voice from the bed, and Bunting started guiltily. "I'm just washing my hands." "Indeed, you're doing nothing of the sort. I never heard of such a thing. Putting your hand into the water in which I was going to wash my face tomorrow morning." "I'm very sorry, Ellen," he said meekly. "I meant to throw it away. You don't suppose I would have let you wash in dirty water, do you?" She said no more, but as he began undressing himself, Mrs. Bunting lay staring at him in a way that made her husband feel even more uncomfortable than he was already. At last he got into bed. He wanted to break the oppressive silence by telling Ellen about the sovereign the young lady had given him, but that sovereign now seemed to Bunting of no more account than if it had been a farthing he had picked up in the road outside. Once more his wife spoke, and he gave so great a start that it shook the bed. "I suppose that you don't know that you've left the light burning in the hall, wasting our good money?" she observed tartly. He got up painfully and opened the door into the passage. It was as she had said. The gas was flaring away, wasting their good money, or rather Mr. Sleuth's good money. Since he had come to be their lodger they had not had to touch their rent money. Bunting turned out the light and groped his way back to the room, and so to bed. Without speaking again to each other, both husband and wife lay awake till dawn. The next morning Mr. Sleuth's landlord awoke with a start. He felt curiously heavy about the limbs, and tired about the eyes. Drawing his watch from under his pillow, he saw that it was 7 o'clock. Without waking his wife, he got out of bed and pulled the blind a little to one side. It was snowing heavily, and, as is the way when it snows, even in London, everything was strangely, curiously still. After he had dressed, he went out into the passage. As he had at once dreaded and hoped, their newspaper was already lying on the mat. It was probably the sound of its being pushed through the letter-box which had waked him from his unrestful sleep. He picked the paper up and went into the sitting-room then. Shutting the door behind him carefully, he spread the newspaper wide open on the table, and bent over it. As Bunting at last looked up and straightened himself, an expression of intense relief shone upon his stolid face. The item of news he had felt certain would be printed in big type on the middle sheet was not there. End of Chapter 21. Chapter 22. Feeling amazingly light-hearted, almost light-headed, Bunting lit the gas ring to make his wife her morning cup of tea. While he was doing it, he suddenly heard her call out. "Bunting!" she cried weakly. "Bunting!" Quickly he hurried in response to her call. "Yes," he said. "What is it, my dear? I won't be a minute with your tea." And he smiled broadly, rather foolishly. She sat up and looked at him, a dazed expression on her face. "What are you grinning at?" she asked suspiciously. "I've had a wonderful piece of luck," he explained. "But you was so cross last night that I simply didn't dare tell you about it." "Well, tell me now," she said in a low voice. "I had a sovereign given me by the young lady. You see, it was her birthday party, Ellen, and she'd come into a nice bit of money, and she gave each of us waiters a sovereign." Mrs. Bunting made no comment. Instead, she lay back and closed her eyes. "What time do you expect Daisy?" she asked languidly. "You didn't say what time Joe was going to fetch her, when we was talking about it yesterday." "Didn't I? Well, I expect they'll be in to dinner." "I wonder how long that old aunt of hers expects us to keep her," said Mrs. Bunting thoughtfully. All the cheer died out of Bunting's round face. He became sullen and angry. It would be a pretty thing if he couldn't have his own daughter for a bit, especially now that they were doing so well. "Daisy'll stay here just as long as she can," he said shortly. "It's too bad of you, Ellen, to talk like that. She helps you all she can, and she risks us both up ever so much. Besides, 'twould be cruel to take the girl away just now, just as she and that young chap are making friends like. One would suppose that even you would see the justice of that." But Mrs. Bunting made no answer. Bunting went off, back into the sitting-room. The water was boiling now, so he made the tea, and then, as he brought the little tray in, his heart softened. Ellen did look really ill and wizened. He wondered if she had a pain about which she wasn't saying anything. She had never been one to grouse about herself. "The lodger and me came in together last night," he observed genially. "He's certainly a funny kind of gentleman. It wasn't the sort of night one would have chosen to go out for a walk, now was it? And yet he must have been out a long time if what he said was true." "I don't wonder a quiet gentleman like Mr. Sleuth hates the crowded streets," she said slowly. "They gets worse every day, that they do. But go along now. I want to get up." He went back into their sitting-room, and, having laid the fire and put a match to it, he sat down comfortably with his newspaper. Deep down in his heart, Bunting looked back to this last night with a feeling of shame and self-rebuke. Whatever had made such horrible thoughts and suspicions as had possessed him suddenly come into his head? And just because of a trifling thing like that blood. No doubt Mr. Sleuth's nose had bled. That was what had happened. Though, come to think of it, he had mentioned brushing up against a dead animal. Perhaps Ellen was right after all. It didn't do for one to be always thinking of dreadful subjects, of murders and such like. It made one go dotty. That's what it did. And just as he was telling himself that, there came to the door a loud knock. The peculiar rat-tat-tat of a telegraph boy. But before he had time to get across the room, let alone to the front door, Ellen had rushed through the room, clad only in a petticoat and shawl. "I'll go," she cried breathlessly. "I'll go, Bunting. Don't you trouble." He stared at her, surprised, and followed her into the hall. She put out a hand, and, hiding herself behind the door, took the telegram from the invisible boy. "You needn't wait," she said. "If there's an answer, we'll send it out ourselves." Then she tore the envelope open. "Oh!" she said with a gasp of relief. "It's only from Joe Chandler, to say he can't go over to fetch Daisy this morning. Then you'll have to go." She walked back into their sitting-room. "There," she said. "There it is, Bunting. You just read it." "Am on duty this morning. Cannot fetch Miss Daisy as arranged. Chandler." "I wonder why he's on duty," said Bunting slowly, uncomfortably. "I thought Joe's hours was as regular as clockwork, that nothing could make any difference to them. However, there it is. I suppose it'll do all right if I start about 11 o'clock? It may have left off snowing by then. I don't feel like going out again just now. I'm pretty tired this morning." "You start about 12," said his wife quickly. "That'll give plenty of time." The morning went on quietly, uneventfully. Bunting received a letter from Old Aunt saying Daisy must come back next Monday, a little under a week from now. Mr. Sleuth slept soundly, or at any rate he made no sign of being awake, and though Mrs. Bunting often stopped to listen while she was doing her room, there came no sounds at all from overhead. Scarcely aware that it was so, both Bunting and his wife felt more cheerful than they had done for a long time. They had quite a pleasant little chat when Mrs. Bunting came and sat down for a bit, before going down to prepare Mr. Sleuth's breakfast. "Daisy will be surprised to see you, not to say disappointed," she observed, and she could not help laughing a little to herself at the thought. And when, at 11, Bunting got up to go, she made him stay on a little longer. "There's no such great hurry as that," she said good-temperedly. "It'll do quite well if you're there by 12:30. I'll get dinner ready myself. Daisy needn't help with that. I expect Margaret has worked her pretty hard." But at last there came the moment when Bunting had to start, and his wife went with him to the front door. It was still snowing, less heavily, but still snowing. There were very few people coming and going, and only just a few cabs and carts dragging cautiously along through the slush. Mrs. Bunting was still in the kitchen when there came a ring and a knock at the door. A now very familiar ring and knock. "Joe thinks Daisy's home again by now," she said, smiling to herself. Before the door was well open, she heard Chandler's voice. "Don't be scared this time, Mrs. Bunting." But though not exactly scared, she did give a gasp of surprise, for there stood Joe, made up to represent a public-house loafer, and he looked the part to perfection, with his hair combed down raggedly over his forehead, his seedy-looking, ill-fitting, dirty clothes, and greenish-black pot hat. "I haven't a minute," he said a little breathlessly, "but I thought I'd just run in to know if Miss Daisy was safe home again. You got my telegram all right? I couldn't send no other kind of message." "She's not back yet. Her father hasn't been gone long after her." Then, struck by a look in his eyes, "Joe, what's the matter?" she asked quickly. There came a thrill of suspense in her voice. Her face grew drawn, while what little color there was in it receded, leaving it very pale. "Well," he said, "well, Mrs. Bunting, I've no business to say anything about it, but I will tell you." He walked in and shut the door of the sitting-room carefully behind him. "There's been another of 'em," he whispered. "But this time no one is to know anything about it. Not for the present, I mean," he corrected himself hastily. "The Yard thinks we've got a clue, and a good clue, too, this time." "But where? And how?" faltered Mrs. Bunting. "Well, 'twas just a bit of luck being able to keep it dark for the present." He still spoke in that stifled, hoarse whisper. "The poor soul was found dead on a bench on Primrose Hill, and just by chance 'twas one of our fellows saw the body first. He was on his way home, over Hampstead way. He knew where he'd be able to get an ambulance quick, and he made a very clever secret job of it. I 'spect he'll get promotion for that." "What about the clue?" asked Mrs. Bunting, with dry lips. "You said there was a clue?" "Well, I don't rightly understand about the clue myself. All I know is it's got something to do with a public house, the Hammer and Tongs, which isn't far off there. They feel sure the Avenger was in the bar just on closing time." And then Mrs. Bunting sat down. She felt better now. It was natural the police should suspect a public-house loafer. "Then that's why you wasn't able to go and fetch Daisy, I suppose?" He nodded. "Mum's the word, Mrs. Bunting. It'll all be in the last editions of the evening newspapers. It can't be kept out. There'd be too much of a row if 'twas." "Are you going off to that public house now?" she asked. "Yes, I am. I've got a awkward job, to try and worm something out of the barmaid." "Something out of the barmaid?" repeated Mrs. Bunting nervously. "Why, whatever for?" He came and stood close to her. "They think 'twas a gentleman," he whispered. "A gentleman?" Mrs. Bunting stared at Chandler with a scared expression. "Whatever makes them think such a silly thing as that?" "Well, just before closing time a very peculiar-looking gent, with a leather bag in his hand, went into the bar and asked for a glass of milk. And what d'you think he did? Paid for it with a sovereign. He wouldn't take no change, just made the girl a present of it. That's why the young woman what served him seems quite unwilling to give him away. She won't tell now what he was like. She doesn't know what he's wanted for, and we don't want her to know just yet. That's one reason why nothing's being said public about it. But there, I really must be going now. My time'll be up at 3 o'clock. I thought of coming in on the way back and asking you for a cup of tea, Mrs. Bunting." "Do," she said. "Do, Joe. You'll be welcome." But there was no welcome in her tired voice. She let him go alone to the door, and then she went down to her kitchen and began cooking Mr. Sleuth's breakfast. The lodger would be sure to ring soon, and then any minute Bunting and Daisy might be home, and they'd want something too. Margaret always had breakfast even when the family were away, unnaturally early. As she bustled about, Mrs. Bunting tried to empty her mind of all thought. But it is very difficult to do that when one is in a state of torturing uncertainty. She had not dared to ask Chandler what they supposed that man who had gone into the public house was really like. It was fortunate, indeed, that the lodger and that inquisitive young chap had never met face to face. At last Mr. Sleuth's bell rang, a quiet little tinkle, but when she went up with his breakfast the lodger was not in his sitting-room. Supposing him to be still in his bedroom, Mrs. Bunting put the cloth on the table, and then she heard the sound of his footsteps coming down the stairs, and her quick ears detected the slight whirring sound which showed that the gas stove was alight. Mr. Sleuth had already lit the stove. That meant that he would carry out some elaborate experiment this afternoon. "Still snowing?" he said doubtfully. "How very, very quiet and still London is when under snow, Mrs. Bunting. I have never known it quite as quiet as this morning. Not a sound, outside or in. A very pleasant change from the shouting which sometimes goes on in the Marylebone Road. "Yes," she said dully. "It's awful quiet today. Too quiet to my thinking. 'Tain't natural like." The outside gate swung to, making a noisy clatter in the still air. "Is that someone coming in here?" asked Mr. Sleuth, drawing a quick, hissing breath. "Perhaps you will oblige me by going to the window and telling me who it is, Mrs. Bunting?" And his landlady obeyed him. "It's only Bunting, sir. Bunting and his daughter." "Oh, is that all?" Mr. Sleuth hurried after her, and she shrank back a little. She had never been quite so near to the lodger before, save on that first day when she had been showing him her rooms. Side by side they stood, looking out of the window. And as if aware that someone was standing there, Daisy turned her bright face up towards the window and smiled at her stepmother, and at the lodger, whose face she could only dimly discern. "A very sweet-looking young girl," said Mr. Sleuth, thoughtfully. And then he quoted a little bit of poetry, and this took Mrs. Bunting very much aback. "Wordsworth," he murmured dreamily. "A poet too little read nowadays, Mrs. Bunting, but one with a beautiful feeling for nature, for youth, for innocence." "Indeed, sir?" Mrs. Bunting stepped back a little. "Your breakfast will be getting cold, sir, if you don't have it now." He went back to the table obediently, and sat down as a child rebuked might have done. And then his landlady left him. "Well," said Bunting cheerily, "everything went off quite all right, and Daisy's a lucky girl, that she is. Her Aunt Margaret gave her 5 shillings." But Daisy did not look as pleased as her father thought she ought to do. "I hope nothing's happened to Mr. Chandler," she said a little disconsolately. "The very last words he said to me last night was that he'd be there at 10 o'clock. I got quite fidgety as the time went on and he didn't come." "He's been here," said Mrs. Bunting slowly. "Been here?" cried her husband. "Then why on earth didn't he go and fetch Daisy if he'd time to come here?" "He was on the way to his job," his wife answered. "You run along, child, downstairs. Now that you are here you can make yourself useful." And Daisy reluctantly obeyed. She wondered what it was her stepmother didn't want her to hear. "I've something to tell you, Bunting." "Yes?" He looked across uneasily. "Yes, Ellen?" "There's been another of those murders, but the police don't want anyone to know about it. Not yet. That's why Joe couldn't go over and fetch Daisy. They're all on duty again." Bunting put out his hand and clutched hold of the edge of the mantelpiece. He had gone very red, but his wife was far too much concerned with her own feelings and sensations to notice it. There was a long silence between them. Then he spoke, making a great effort to appear unconcerned. "And where did it happen?" he asked. "Close to the other one?" She hesitated, then, "I don't know. He didn't say. But hush!" she added quickly. "Here's Daisy. Don't let's talk of that horror in front of her, like. Besides, I promised Chandler I'd be mum." And he acquiesced. "You can be laying the cloth, child, while I go up and clear away the lodger's breakfast." Without waiting for an answer she hurried upstairs. Mr. Sleuth had left the greater part of the nice lemon sole untouched. "I don't feel well to-day," he said fretfully. "And, Mrs. Bunting, I should be much obliged if your husband would lend me that paper I saw in his hand. I do not often care to look at the public prints, but I should like to do so now." She flew downstairs. "Bunting," she said a little breathlessly, "the lodger would like you just to lend him the Sun." Bunting handed it over to her. "I've read it through," he observed. "You can tell him that I don't want it back again." On her way up she glanced down at the pink sheet. Occupying a third of the space was an irregular drawing, and under it was written, in rather large characters: "We are glad to be able to present our readers with an authentic reproduction of the footprint of the half-worn rubber sole which was almost certainly worn by the Avenger when he committed his double murder 10 days ago." She went into the sitting-room. To her relief it was empty. "Kindly put the paper down on the table," came Mr. Sleuth's muffled voice from the upper landing. She did so. "Yes, sir, and Bunting don't want the paper back again, sir. He says he's read it." And then she hurried out of the room. End of Chapter 22. Chapter 23. All afternoon it went on snowing, and the three of them sat there, listening and waiting, Bunting and his wife hardly knew for what, Daisy for the knock which would herald Joe Chandler. And about 4 there came the now familiar sound. Mrs. Bunting hurried out into the passage, and as she opened the front door she whispered, "We haven't said anything to Daisy yet. Young girls can't keep secrets." Chandler nodded comprehendingly. He now looked the low character he had assumed to the life, for he was blue with cold, disheartened and tired out. Daisy gave a little cry of shocked surprise, of amusement, of welcome, when she saw how cleverly he was disguised. "I never!" she exclaimed. "What a difference it do make, to be sure! Why, you looks quite horrid, Mr. Chandler." And somehow that little speech of hers amused her father so much that he quite cheered up. Bunting had been very dull and quiet all that afternoon. "It won't take me 10 minutes to make myself respectable again," said the young man rather ruefully. His host and hostess, looking at him eagerly, furtively, both came to the conclusion that he had been unsuccessful, that he had failed, that is, in getting any information worth having. And though, in a sense, they all had a pleasant tea together, there was an air of constraint, even of discomfort, over the little party. Bunting felt it hard that he couldn't ask the questions that were trembling on his lips. He would have felt it hard any time during the last month to refrain from knowing anything Joe could tell him, but now it seemed almost intolerable to be in this queer kind of half-suspense. There was one important fact he longed to know, and at last came his opportunity of doing so, for Joe Chandler rose to leave, and this time it was Bunting who followed him out into the hall. "Where did it happen?" he whispered. "Just tell me that, Joe." "Primrose Hill," said the other briefly. "You'll know all about it in a minute or two, for it'll be all in the last editions of the evening papers. That's what's been arranged." "No arrest, I suppose?" Chandler shook his head despondently. "No," he said. "I'm inclined to think the Yard was on a wrong tack altogether this time. But one can only do one's best. I don't know if Mrs. Bunting told you I'd got to question a barmaid about a man who was in her place just before closing time. Well, she said all she knew, and it's as clear as daylight to me that the eccentric old gent she talks about was only a harmless loony. He gave her a sovereign just because she told him she was a teetotaler." He laughed ruefully. Even Bunting was diverted at the notion. "Well, that's a queer thing for a barmaid to be!" he exclaimed. "She's niece to the people what keeps the public," explained Chandler, and then he went out of the front door with a cheerful "So long." When Bunting went back into the sitting-room, Daisy had disappeared. She had gone downstairs with the tray. "Where's my girl?" he said irritably. "She's just taken the tray downstairs." He went out to the top of the kitchen stairs and called out sharply, "Daisy! Daisy, child! Are you down there?" "Yes, father," came her eager, happy voice. "Better come up out of that cold kitchen." He turned and came back to his wife. "Ellen, is the lodger in? I haven't heard him moving about. Now mind what I says, please. I don't want Daisy to be mixed up with him." "Mr. Sleuth don't seem very well today," answered Mrs. Bunting quietly. "'Tain't likely I should let Daisy have anything to do with him. Why, she's never even seen him. 'Tain't likely I should allow her to begin waiting on him now." But though she was surprised and a little irritated by the tone in which Bunting had spoken, no glimmer of the truth illumined her mind. So accustomed had she become to bearing alone the burden of her awful secret that it would have required far more than a cross word or two, far more than the fact that Bunting looked ill and tired, for her to have come to suspect that her secret was now shared by another, and that other her husband. Again and again the poor soul had agonized and trembled at the thought of her house being invaded by the police, but that was only because she had always credited the police with supernatural powers of detection. That they should come to know the awful fact she kept hidden in her breast would have seemed to her, on the whole, a natural thing, but that Bunting should even dimly suspect it appeared beyond the range of possibility. And yet even Daisy noticed a change in her father. He sat cowering over the fire, saying nothing, doing nothing. "Why, father, ain't you well?" the girl asked more than once. And looking up he would answer, "Yes, I'm well enough, my girl, but I feels cold. It's awful cold. I never did feel anything like the cold we've got just now." At 8 the now familiar shouts and cries began again outside. "The Avenger again! Another horrible crime! Extra special edition!" Such were the shouts, the exultant yells, hurled through the clear, cold air. They fell, like bombs, into the quiet room. Both Bunting and his wife remained silent, but Daisy's cheeks grew pink with excitement, and her eyes sparkled. "Hark, father! Hark, Ellen! D'ye hear that?" she exclaimed childishly, and even clapped her hands. "I do wish Mr. Chandler had been here. He would have been startled." "Don't, Daisy," and Bunting frowned. Then, getting up, he stretched himself. "It's fair getting on my mind," he said, "these terrible things happening. I'd like to get right away from London, just as far as I could, that I would." "Up to John o' Groat's?" said Daisy, laughing. And then, "Why, father, ain't you going out to get a paper?" "Yes, I suppose I must." Slowly he went out of the room, and, lingering a moment in the hall, he put on his greatcoat and hat. Then he opened the front door and walked down the flagged path. Opening the iron gate, he stepped out on the pavement, then crossed the road to where the newspaper boys now stood. The boy nearest to him only had the Sun, a late edition of the paper he had already read. It annoyed Bunting to give a penny for a halfpenny rag of which he already knew the main contents, but there was nothing else to do. Standing under a lamp-post, he opened out the newspaper. It was bitingly cold. That, perhaps, was why his hand shook as he looked down at the big headlines, for Bunting had been very unfair to the enterprise of the editor of his favourite evening paper. This special edition was full of new matter concerning the Avenger. First, in huge type right across the page, was the brief statement that the Avenger had now committed his 9th crime, and that he had chosen quite a new locality, namely, the lonely stretch of rising ground known to Londoners as Primrose Hill. "The police," so Bunting read, "are very reserved as to the circumstances which led to the finding of the body of the Avenger's latest victim. But we have reason to believe that they possess several really important clues, and that one of them is concerned with the half-worn rubber sole of which we are the first to reproduce an outline today. See over page." And Bunting, turning the sheet round about, saw the irregular outline he had already seen in the early edition of the Sun, that purporting to be a facsimile of the imprint left by the Avenger's rubber sole. He stared down at the rough outline which took up so much of the space which should have been devoted to reading matter, with a queer sinking feeling of terrified alarm. Again and again criminals had been tracked by the marks their boots or shoes had made at or near the scenes of their misdoings. Practically the only job Bunting did in his own house of a menial kind was the cleaning of the boots and shoes. He had already visualized early this very afternoon the little row with which he dealt each morning. First came his wife's strong, serviceable boots, then his own 2 pairs, a good deal patched and mended, and next to his own Mr. Sleuth's strong, hardly worn and expensive buttoned boots. Of late, a dear little coquettish, high-heeled pair of outdoor shoes with thin, paper-like soles, bought by Daisy for her trip to London, had ended the row. The girl had worn these thin shoes persistently, in defiance of Ellen's reproof and advice, and he, Bunting, had only once had to clean her more sensible country pair, and that only because the others had become wet the day he and she had accompanied young Chandler to Scotland Yard. Slowly he returned across the road. Somehow the thought of going in again, of hearing his wife's sarcastic comments, of parrying Daisy's eager questions, had become intolerable. So he walked slowly, trying to put off the evil moment when he would have to tell them what was in his paper. The lamp under which he had stood reading was not exactly opposite the house. It was rather to the right of it; and when, having crossed over the roadway, he walked along the pavement towards his own gate, he heard odd, shuffling sounds coming from the inner side of the low wall which shut off his little courtyard from the pavement. Now, under ordinary circumstances Bunting would have rushed forward to drive out whoever was there. He and his wife had often had trouble, before the cold weather began, with vagrants seeking shelter there. But tonight he stayed outside, listening intently, sick with suspense and fear. Was it possible that their place was being watched, already? He thought it was only too likely. Bunting, like Mrs. Bunting, credited the police with almost supernatural powers, especially since he had paid that visit to Scotland Yard. But to Bunting's amazement, and, yes, relief, it was his lodger who suddenly loomed up in the dim light. Mr. Sleuth must have been stooping down, for his tall, lank form had been quite concealed till he stepped forward from behind the low wall onto the flagged path leading to the front door. The lodger was carrying a brown paper parcel, and as he walked along, the new boots he was wearing creaked, and the tap-tap of hard, nail-studded heels rang out on the flat stones of the narrow path. Bunting, still standing outside the gate, suddenly knew what it was his lodger had been doing on the other side of the low wall. Mr. Sleuth had evidently been out to buy himself another pair of new boots, and then he had gone inside the gate and had put them on, placing his old footgear in the paper in which the new pair had been wrapped. The ex-butler waited quite a long time, not only until Mr. Sleuth had let himself into the house, but till the lodger had had time to get well away, upstairs. Then he also walked up the flagged pathway, and put his latchkey in the door. He lingered as long over the job of hanging his hat and coat up in the hall as he dared, in fact, till his wife called out to him. Then he went in, and throwing the paper down on the table, he said sullenly, "There it is. You can see it all for yourself, not that there's very much to see," and groped his way to the fire. His wife looked at him in sharp alarm. "Whatever have you done to yourself?" she exclaimed. "You're ill. That's what it is, Bunting. You got a chill last night." "I told you I'd got a chill," he muttered. "'Twasn't last night, though. 'Twas going out this morning, coming back in the bus. Margaret keeps that housekeeper's room of hers like a hothouse, that's what she does. 'Twas going out from there into the biting wind, that's what did for me. It must be awful to stand about in such weather. 'Tis a wonder to me how that young fellow Joe Chandler can stand the life, being out in all weathers like he is." Bunting spoke at random, his one anxiety being to get away from what was in the paper, which now lay neglected on the table. "Those that keep out o' doors all day never do come to no harm," said his wife testily. "But if you felt so bad, whatever was you out so long for, Bunting? I thought you'd gone away somewhere. Do you mean you only went to get the paper?" "I just stopped for a second to look at it under the lamp," he muttered apologetically. "That was a silly thing to do." "Perhaps it was," he admitted meekly. Daisy had taken up the paper. "Well, they don't say much," she said disappointedly. "Hardly anything at all. But perhaps Mr. Chandler'll be in soon again. If so, he'll tell us more about it." "A young girl like you oughtn't to want to know anything about murders," said her stepmother severely. "Joe won't think any the better of you for your inquisitiveness about such things. If I was you, Daisy, I shouldn't say nothing about it if he does come in, which I fair tell you I hope he won't. I've seen enough of that young chap to-day." "He didn't come in for long, not to-day," said Daisy, her lip trembling. "I can tell you one thing that'll surprise you, my dear." Mrs. Bunting looked significantly at her stepdaughter. She also wanted to get away from that dread news, which yet was no news. "Yes," said Daisy rather defiantly. "What is it, Ellen?" "Maybe you'll be surprised to hear that Joe did come in this morning. He knew all about that affair then, but he particular asked that you shouldn't be told anything about it." "Never!" cried Daisy, much mortified. "Yes," went on her stepmother ruthlessly. "You just ask your father over there if it isn't true." "'Tain't a healthy thing to speak overmuch about such happenings," said Bunting heavily. "If I was Joe," went on Mrs. Bunting, quickly pursuing her advantage, I shouldn't want to talk about such horrid things when I comes in to have a quiet chat with friends. But the minute he comes in that poor young chap is set upon, mostly, I admit, by your father." She looked at her husband severely. "But you does your share too, Daisy. You asks him this, you asks him that. He's fair puzzled sometimes. It don't do to be so inquisitive." And perhaps because of this little sermon on Mrs. Bunting's part, when young Chandler did come in again that evening, very little was said of the new Avenger murder. Bunting made no reference to it at all, and though Daisy said a word, it was but a word. And Joe Chandler thought he had never spent a pleasanter evening in his life, for it was he and Daisy who talked all the time, their elders remaining for the most part silent. Daisy told of all that she had done with Aunt Margaret. She described the long, dull hours and the queer jobs her aunt set her to do, the washing up of all the fine drawing-room china in a big basin lined with flannel, and how terrified she, Daisy, had been lest there should come even one teeny little chip to any of it. Then she went on to relate some of the funny things Aunt Margaret had told her about "the family." There came a really comic tale, which hugely interested and delighted Chandler. This was of how Aunt Margaret's lady had been taken in by an impostor who had come up, just as she was stepping out of her carriage, and pretended to have a fit on the doorstep. Aunt Margaret's lady, being a soft one, had insisted on the man coming into the hall, where he had been given all kinds of restoratives. When the man had at last gone off, it was found that he had "wolfed" young master's best walking-stick, one with a fine tortoise-shell top to it. Thus had Aunt Margaret proved to her lady that the man had been shamming, and her lady had been very angry—near had a fit herself. "There's a lot of that about," said Chandler, laughing. "Incorrigible rogues and vagabonds, that's what those sort of people are." And then he, in his turn, told an elaborate tale of an exceptionally clever swindler who he himself had brought to book. He was very proud of that job; it had formed a white stone in his career as a detective. And even Mrs. Bunting was quite interested to hear about it. Chandler was still sitting there when Mr. Sleuth's bell rang. For a while no one stirred. Then Bunting looked questioningly at his wife. "Did you hear that?" he said. "I think, Ellen, that was the lodger's bell." She got up, without alacrity, and went upstairs. "I rang," said Mr. Sleuth weakly, "to tell you I don't require any supper tonight, Mrs. Bunting. Only a glass of milk with a lump of sugar in it. That is all I require, nothing more. I feel very, very far from well." And he had a hunted, plaintive expression on his face. "And then I thought your husband would like his paper back again, Mrs. Bunting." Mrs. Bunting, looking at him fixedly with a sad intensity of gaze of which she was quite unconscious, answered, "Oh, no, sir. Bunting don't require that paper now. He read it all through." Something impelled her to add ruthlessly, "He's got another paper by now, sir. You may have heard them come shouting outside. Would you like me to bring you up that other paper, sir?" And Mr. Sleuth shook his head. "No," he said querulously. "I much regret now having asked for the one paper I did read, for it disturbed me, Mrs. Bunting. There was nothing of any value in it. There never is in any public print. I gave up reading newspapers years ago, and I much regret that I broke my rule today." And as if to indicate to her that he did not wish for any more conversation, the lodger then did what he had never done before in his landlady's presence. He went over to the fireplace and deliberately turned his back on her. She went down and brought up the glass of milk and the lump of sugar he had asked for. Now he was in his usual place, sitting at the table, studying the book. When Mrs. Bunting went back to the others they were chatting merrily. She did not notice that the merriment was confined to the two young people. "Well," said Daisy pertly, "how about the lodger, Ellen? Is he all right?" "Yes," she said stiffly, "of course he is." "He must feel pretty dull sitting up there all by himself. Awful lonely like, I call it," said the girl. But her stepmother remained silent. "Whatever does he do with himself all day?" persisted Daisy. "Just now he's reading the Bible," Mrs. Bunting answered, shortly and dryly. "Well, I never! That's a funny thing for a gentleman to do." And Joe, alone of her three listeners, laughed, a long, hearty peal of amusement. "There's nothing to laugh at," said Mrs. Bunting sharply. "I should feel ashamed of being caught laughing at anything connected with the Bible." and poor Joe became suddenly quite serious. This was the first time that Mrs. Bunting had ever spoken really nastily to him, and he answered very humbly, "I beg pardon. I know I oughtn't to have laughed at anything to do with the Bible, but you see Miss Daisy said it so funny like, and by all accounts your lodger must be a queer card, Mrs. Bunting." "He's no queerer than many people I could mention," she said quickly, and with these enigmatic words she got up and left the room. End of Chapter 23. Chapter 24. Each hour of the days that followed held for Bunting its full meed of aching fear and suspense. The unhappy man was ever debating within himself what course he should pursue, and, according to his mood, and to the state of his mind at any particular moment, he would waver between various widely differing lines of action. He told himself again and again, and with fretful unease, that the most awful thing about it all was that he wasn't sure. If only he could have been sure, he might have made up his mind exactly what it was he ought to do. But when telling himself this he was deceiving himself, and he was vaguely conscious of the fact, for, from Bunting's point of view, almost any alternative would have been preferable to that which to some, nay, perhaps to most, householders would have seemed the only thing to do, namely, to go to the police. But Londoners of Bunting's class have an uneasy fear of the law. To his mind it would be ruin for him and for his Ellen to be mixed up publicly in such a terrible affair. No one concerned in the business would give them and their future a thought, but it would track them to their dying day, and above all, it would make it quite impossible for them ever to get again into a good joint situation. It was that for which Bunting, in his secret soul, now longed with all his heart. No, some other way than going to the police must be found, and he racked his slow brain to find it. The worst of it was that every hour that went by made his future course more difficult and more delicate, and increased the awful weight on his conscience. If only he really knew! If only he could feel quite sure! And then he would tell himself that, after all, he had very little to go upon. Only suspicion. Suspicion, and a secret, horrible certainty that his suspicion was justified. And so at last Bunting began to long for a solution which he knew to be indefensible from every point of view. He began to hope, that is, in the depths of his heart, that the lodger would again go out one evening on his horrible business and be caught, red-handed. But far from going out on any business, horrible or other, Mr. Sleuth now never went out at all. He kept upstairs and often spent quite a considerable part of his day in bed. He still felt, so he assured Mrs. Bunting, very far from well. He had never thrown off the chill he had caught on that bitter night he and his landlord had met on their several ways home. Joe Chandler, too, had become a terrible complication to Daisy's father. The detective spent every waking hour that he was not on duty with the Buntings, and Bunting, who at one time had liked him so well and so cordially, now became mortally afraid of him. But though the young man talked of little else than the Avenger, and though on one evening he described at immense length the eccentric-looking gent who had given the barmaid a sovereign, picturing Mr. Sleuth with such awful accuracy that both Bunting and Mrs. Bunting secretly and separately turned sick when they listened to him, he never showed the slightest interest in their lodger. At last there came a morning when Bunting and Chandler held a strange conversation about the Avenger. The young fellow had come in earlier than usual, and just as he arrived, Mrs. Bunting and Daisy were starting out to do some shopping. The girl would fain have stopped behind, but her stepmother had given her a very peculiar, disagreeable look, daring her, so to speak, to be so forward, and Daisy had gone on with a flushed, angry look on her pretty face. And then, as young Chandler stepped through into the sitting-room, it suddenly struck Bunting that the young man looked unlike himself. Indeed, to the ex-butler's apprehension, there was something almost threatening in Chandler's attitude. "I want a word with you, Mr. Bunting," he began abruptly, falteringly, "and I'm glad to have the chance now that Mrs. Bunting and Miss Daisy are out." Bunting braced himself to hear the awful words, the accusation of having sheltered a murderer, the monster whom all the world was seeking, under his roof. And then he remembered a phrase, a horrible legal phrase, accessory after the fact. Yes, he had been that. There wasn't any doubt about it. "Yes?" he said. "What is it, Joe? and then the unfortunate man sat down in his chair. "Yes?" he said again, uncertainly, for young Chandler had now advanced to the table. He was looking at Bunting fixedly, the other thought threateningly. "Well, out with it, Joe. Don't keep me in suspense." And then a slight smile broke over the young man's face. "I don't think what I've got to say can take you by surprise, Mr. Bunting." And Bunting wagged his head in a way that might mean anything, yes or no, as the case might be. The two men looked at one another for what seemed a very, very long time to the elder of them. And then, making a great effort, Joe Chandler brought out the words. "Well, I suppose you know what it is I want to talk about. I'm sure Mrs. Bunting would, from a look or two she's lately cast on me. It's your daughter. It's Miss Daisy." And then Bunting gave a kind of cry, twixt a sob and a laugh. "My girl!" he cried. "Good Lord, Joe! Is that all you wants to talk about? Why, you fair frightened me, that you did." And indeed the relief was so great that the room swam round as he stared across it at his daughter's lover, that lover who was also the embodiment of that now awful thing to him, the law. He smiled, rather foolishly, at his visitor, and Chandler felt a sharp wave of irritation, of impatience sweep over his good-natured soul. Daisy's father was an old stupid. That's what he was. And then Bunting grew serious. The room ceased to go round. "As far as I'm concerned," he said, with a good deal of solemnity, even a little dignity, "you have my blessing, Joe. You're a very likely young chap, and I had a true respect for your father." "Yes," said Chandler, "that's very kind of you, Mr. Bunting. But how about her herself?" Bunting stared at him. It pleased him to think that Daisy hadn't given herself away, as Ellen was always hinting the girl was doing. "I can't answer for Daisy," he said heavily. "You'll have to ask her yourself. That's not a job any other man can do for you, my lad." "I never gets a chance. I never sees her, not by our two selves," said Chandler with some heat. "You don't seem to understand, Mr. Bunting, that I never do see Miss Daisy alone," he repeated. "I hear now that she's going away Monday, and I've only once had the chance of a walk with her. Mrs. Bunting's very particular, not to say pernickety in her ideas, Mr. Bunting." "That's a fault on the right side, that is, with a young girl," said Bunting thoughtfully. And Chandler nodded. He quite agreed that as regarded other young chaps Mrs. Bunting could not be too particular. "She's been brought up like a lady, my Daisy has," went on Bunting with some pride. "That old aunt of hers hardly lets her out of her sight." "I was coming to the old aunt," said Chandler heavily. "Mrs. Bunting, she talks as if your daughter was going to stay with that old woman the whole of her natural life. Now, is that right? That's what I wants to ask you, Mr. Bunting. Is that right?" "I'll say a word to Ellen, don't you fear," said Bunting abstractedly. His mind had wandered off, away from Daisy and this nice young chap, to his now constant, anxious preoccupation. "You come along to-morrow," he said, "and I'll see you gets your walk with Daisy. It's only right you and she should have a chance of seeing one another without old folk being by, else how's the girl to tell whether she likes you or not? For the matter of that, you hardly knows her, Joe." He looked at the young man consideringly. Chandler shook his head impatiently. "I knows her quite as well as I wants to know her," he said. "I made up my mind the very first time I seed her, Mr. Bunting." "No! Did you really?" said Bunting. "Well, come to think of it, I did so with her mother. Aye, and years after with Ellen, too. But I hope you'll never want no second, Chandler." "God forbid," said the young man under his breath, and then he asked, rather longingly, "Do you think they'll be out long now, Mr. Bunting?" And Bunting woke up to a due sense of hospitality. Sit down, do," he said hastily. "I don't believe they'll be very long. They've only got a little bit of shopping to do." And then, in a changed, in a ringing, nervous tone, he asked, "And how about your job, Joe? Nothing new, I take it? I suppose you're all just waiting for the next time?" "Aye, that's about the figure of it." Chandler's voice had also changed. It was now somber, menacing. "We're fair tired of it, beginning to wonder when it'll end, that we are." "Do you ever try and make to yourself a picture of what the master's like?" asked Bunting. Somehow he felt he must ask that. "Yes," said Joe slowly. "I've a sort of notion. A savage, fierce-looking devil, the chap must be. It's that description that was circulated put us wrong. I don't believe it was the man that knocked up against that woman in the fog. No, not one bit I don't. But I wavers. I can't quite make up my mind. Sometimes I think it's a sailor. The foreigner they talks about, that goes away for 8 or 9 days in between, to Holland maybe, or to France. Then again, I says to myself that it's a butcher, a man from the Central Market. Whoever it is, it's someone used to killing, that's flat. Then it don't seem to you possible— Bunting got up and walked over to the window. You don't take any stock, I suppose, in that idea some of the papers put out, that the man is— Then he hesitated and brought out with a gasp, "A gentleman." Chandler looked at him, surprised. "No," he said deliberately. "I've made up my mind that's quite a wrong tack, though I knows that some of our fellows, big pots too, are quite sure that the fellow what gave the girl the sovereign is the man we're looking for. You see, Mr. Bunting, if that's the fact, well, it stands to reason the fellow's an escaped lunatic, and if he's an escaped lunatic he's got a keeper, and they'd be raising a hue and cry after him, now wouldn't they?" "You don't think," went on Bunting, lowering his voice, "that he could be just staying somewhere, lodging like?" "Do you mean that the Avenger may be a toff, staying in some West End hotel, Mr. Bunting? Well, things almost as funny as that'd be have come to pass." He smiled as if the notion was a funny one. "Yes, something of that sort," muttered Bunting. "Well, if your idea's correct, Mr. Bunting—" "I never said 'twas my idea," said Bunting, all in a hurry. "Well, if that idea's correct, then, 'twill make our task more difficult than ever. Why, 'twould be looking for a needle in a field of hay, Mr. Bunting. But there, I don't think it's anything quite so unlikely as that, not myself, I don't." He hesitated. "There's some of us," he lowered his voice, "that hopes he'll betake himself off, the Avenger, I mean, to another big city, to Manchester or to Edinburgh. There'd be plenty of work for him to do there," and Chandler chuckled at his own grim joke. And then, to both men's secret relief, for Bunting was now mortally afraid of this discussion concerning the Avenger and his doings, they heard Mrs. Bunting's key in the lock. Daisy blushed rosy red with pleasure when she saw that young Chandler was still there. She had feared that when they got home he would be gone, the more so that Ellen, just as if she was doing it on purpose, had lingered aggravatingly long over each small purchase. "Here's Joe come to ask if he can take Daisy out for a walk," blurted out Bunting. "My mother says as how she'd like you to come to tea over at Richmond," said Chandler awkwardly. "I just come in to see whether we could fix it up, Miss Daisy," and Daisy looked imploringly at her stepmother. "Do you mean now? This minute?" asked Mrs. Bunting tartly. "No, o' course not," Bunting broke in hastily. "How you do go on, Ellen!" "What day did your mother mention would be convenient to her?" asked Mrs. Bunting, looking at the young man satirically. Chandler hesitated. His mother had not mentioned any special day. In fact, his mother had shown a surprising lack of anxiety to see Daisy at all. But he had talked her round. "How about Saturday?" suggested Bunting. "That's Daisy's birthday. 'Twould be a birthday treat for her to go to Richmond, and she's going back to Old Aunt on Monday." "I can't go Saturday," said Chandler disconsolately. "I'm on duty Saturday." "Well then, let it be Sunday," said Bunting firmly, and his wife looked at him surprised. He seldom asserted himself so much in her presence. "What do you say, Miss Daisy?" said Chandler. "Sunday would be very nice," said Daisy demurely. And then, as the young man took up his hat, and as her stepmother did not stir, Daisy ventured to go out into the hall with him for a minute. Chandler shut the door behind them, and so was spared the hearing of Mrs. Bunting's whispered remark. "When I was a young woman, folk didn't gallivant about on Sunday. Those who was courting used to go to church together, decent like." End of Chapter 24. Chapter 25. Daisy's 18th birthday dawned uneventfully. Her father gave her what he had always promised she should have on her 18th birthday, a watch. It was a pretty little silver watch, which Bunting had bought second-hand on the last day he had been happy. It seemed a long, long time ago now. Mrs. Bunting thought a silver watch a very extravagant present, but she was far too wretched, far too absorbed in her own thoughts, to trouble much about it. Besides, in such matters she had generally had the good sense not to interfere between her husband and his child. In the middle of the birthday morning Bunting went out to buy himself some more tobacco. He had never smoked so much as in the last 4 days, excepting, perhaps, the week that had followed on his leaving service. Smoking a pipe had then held all the exquisite pleasure which we are told attaches itself to the eating of forbidden fruit. His tobacco had now become his only relaxation. It acted on his nerves as an opiate, soothing his fears and helping him to think. But he had been overdoing it, and it was that which now made him feel so jumpy, so he assured himself, when he found himself starting at any casual sound outside, or even when his wife spoke to him suddenly. Just now Ellen and Daisy were down in the kitchen, and Bunting didn't quite like the sensation of knowing that there was only one pair of stairs between Mr. Sleuth and himself. So he quietly slipped out of the house without telling Ellen that he was going out. In the last 4 days Bunting had avoided his usual haunts. Above all, he had avoided even passing the time of day to his acquaintances and neighbours. He feared, with a great fear, that they would talk to him of a subject which, because it filled his mind to the exclusion of all else, might make him betray the knowledge—no, not knowledge, rather the suspicion that dwelt within him. But today the unfortunate man had a curious, instinctive longing for human companionship, that is, other than that of his wife and of his daughter. This longing for a change of company finally led him into a small, populous thoroughfare hard by the Edgware Road. There were more people there than usual just now, for the housewives of the neighbourhood were doing their Saturday marketing for Sunday. The ex-butler turned into a small, old-fashioned shop where he generally bought his tobacco. Bunting passed the time of day with the tobacconist, and the two fell into desultory talk, but to his customer's relief and surprise, the man made no allusion to the subject of which all the neighbourhood must still be talking. And then, quite suddenly, while still standing by the counter, and before he had paid for the packet of tobacco he held in his hand, Bunting, through the open door, saw with horrified surprise that Ellen, his wife, was standing, alone, outside a greengrocer's shop just opposite. Muttering a word of apology, he rushed out of the shop and across the road. "Ellen," he gasped hoarsely, "you've never gone and left my little girl alone in the house with the lodger?" Mrs. Bunting's face went yellow with fear. "I thought you was indoors," she cried. "You was indoors. Whatever made you come out for, without first making sure I'd stay in?" Bunting made no answer, but as they stared at each other in exasperated silence, each now knew that the other knew. They turned and scurried down the crowded street. "Don't run," he said suddenly. "We shall get there just as quickly if we walk fast. People are noticing you, Ellen. Don't run." He spoke breathlessly, but it was breathlessness induced by fear and by excitement, not by the quick pace at which they were walking. At last they reached their own gate, and Bunting pushed past in front of his wife. After all, Daisy was his child. Ellen couldn't know how he was feeling. He seemed to take the path in one leap, then fumbled for a moment with his latch-key. Opening wide the door, "Daisy!" he called out in a wailing voice. "Daisy, my dear, where are you?" "Here I am, father. What is it?" "She's all right." Bunting turned a grey face to his wife. "She's all right, Ellen." He waited a moment, leaning against the wall of the passage. "It did give me a turn," he said, and then warningly, "Don't frighten the girl, Ellen." Daisy was standing before the fire in their sitting-room, admiring herself in the glass. "Oh, father," she exclaimed, without turning round, "I've seen the lodger. He's quite a nice gentleman, though to be sure he does look a cure. He rang his bell, but I didn't like to go up, and so he came down to ask Ellen for something. We had quite a nice little chat, that we had. I told him it was my birthday, and he asked me and Ellen to go to Madame Tussaud's with him this afternoon." She laughed, a little self-consciously. "Of course, I could see he was 'centric, and then at first he spoke so funnily. 'And who be you?' he says, threatening-like. And I says to him, 'I'm Mr. Bunting's daughter, sir.' 'Then you're a very fortunate girl,' that's what he says, Ellen, 'to 'ave such a nice stepmother as you've got. That's why,' he says, 'you look such a good innocent girl.' And then he quoted a bit of the prayer book. 'Keep innocency,' he says, wagging his head at me. Lor', it made me feel as if I was with Old Aunt again." "I won't have you going out with the lodger. That's flat." Bunting spoke in a muffled, angry tone. He was wiping his forehead with one hand, while with the other he mechanically squeezed the little packet of tobacco, for which, as he now remembered, he had forgotten to pay. Daisy pouted. "Oh, father, I think you might let me have a treat on my birthday. I told him that Saturday wasn't a very good day, at least so I'd heard, for Madame Tussaud's. Then he said we could go early, while the fine folk are still having their dinners." She turned to her stepmother, then giggled happily. "He particularly said you was to come, too. The lodger has a wonderful fancy for you, Ellen. If I was father, I'd feel quite jealous." Her last words were cut across by a tap-tap on the door. Bunting and his wife looked at each other apprehensively. Was it possible that, in their agitation, they had left the front door open, and that someone, some merciless myrmidon of the law, had crept in behind them? Both felt a curious thrill of satisfaction when they saw that it was only Mr. Sleuth. Mr. Sleuth dressed for going out. The tall hat he had worn when he had first come to them was in his hand, but he was wearing a coat instead of his Inverness cape. "I heard you come in," he addressed Mrs. Bunting in his high, whistling, hesitating voice, "and so I've come down to ask you if you and Miss Bunting will come to Madame Tussaud's now. I have never seen those famous waxworks, though I've heard of the place all my life." As Bunting forced himself to look fixedly at his lodger, a sudden doubt bringing with it a sense of immeasurable relief came to Mr. Sleuth's landlord. Surely it was inconceivable that this gentle, mild-mannered gentleman could be the monster of cruelty and cunning that Bunting had now for the terrible space of 4 days believed him to be. He tried to catch his wife's eye, but Mrs. Bunting was looking away, staring into vacancy. She still, of course, wore the bonnet and cloak in which she had just been out to do her marketing. Daisy was already putting on her hat and coat. "Well?" said Mr. Sleuth. Then Mrs. Bunting turned, and it seemed to his landlady that he was looking at her threateningly. "Well?" "Yes, sir. We'll come in a minute," she said dully. End of Chapter 25. Chapter 26. Madame Tussaud's had hitherto held pleasant memories for Mrs. Bunting. In the days when she and Bunting were courting, they often spent there part of their afternoon out. The butler had an acquaintance, a man named Hopkins, who was one of the waxworks staff, and this man had sometimes given him passes for "self and lady." But this was the first time Mrs. Bunting had been inside the place since she had come to live almost next door, as it were, to the big building. They walked in silence to the familiar entrance, and then, after the ill-assorted trio had gone up the great staircase and into the first gallery, Mr. Sleuth suddenly stopped short. The presence of those curious, still, waxen figures which suggest so strangely death in life seemed to surprise and affright him. Daisy took quick advantage of the lodger's hesitation and unease. "Oh, Ellen," she cried, "do let us begin by going into the Chamber of Horrors. I've never been in there. Old Aunt made father promise he wouldn't take me the only time I've ever been here. But now that I'm 18 I can do just as I like. Besides, Old Aunt will never know." Mr. Sleuth looked down at her, and a smile passed for a moment over his worn, gaunt face. "Yes," he said, "let us go into the Chamber of Horrors. That's a good idea, Miss Bunting. I've always wanted to see the Chamber of Horrors." They turned into the great room in which the Napoleonic relics were then kept, and which led into the curious, vault-like chamber where waxen effigies of dead criminals stand grouped in wooden docks. Mrs. Bunting was at once disturbed and relieved to see her husband's old acquaintance, Mr. Hopkins, in charge of the turnstile admitting the public to the Chamber of Horrors. "Well, you are a stranger," the man observed genially. "I do believe that this is the very first time I've seen you in here, Mrs. Bunting, since you was married." "Yes," she said, "that is so. And this is my husband's daughter, Daisy. I expect you've heard of her, Mr. Hopkins. And this," she hesitated a moment, "is our lodger, Mr. Sleuth." But Mr. Sleuth frowned and shuffled away. Daisy, leaving her stepmother's side, joined him. 2, as all the world knows, is company. 3 is none. Mrs. Bunting put down 3 sixpences. "Wait a minute," said Hopkins. "You can't go into the Chamber of Horrors just yet. But you won't have to wait more than 4 or 5 minutes, Mrs. Bunting. It's this way, you see. Our boss is in there showing a party round." He lowered his voice. "It's Sir John Burney. I suppose you know who Sir John Burney is?" "No," she answered indifferently. "I don't know that I ever heard of him." She felt slightly, oh, very slightly, uneasy about Daisy. She would have liked her stepdaughter to keep well within sight and sound, but Mr. Sleuth was now taking the girl down to the other end of the room. "Well, I hope you never will know him, not in any personal sense, Mrs. Bunting." The man chuckled. "He's the Commissioner of Police, the new one, that's what Sir John Burney is. One of the gentlemen he's showing round our place is the Paris police boss, whose job is on all fours, so to speak, with Sir John's. The Frenchie has brought his daughter with him, and there are several other ladies. Ladies always likes horrors, Mrs. Bunting. That's our experience here. Oh, take me to the Chamber of Horrors! That's what they say the minute they gets into this here building." Mrs. Bunting looked at him thoughtfully. It occurred to Mr. Hopkins that she was very wan and tired. She used to look better in the old days, when she was still in service, before Bunting married her. "Yes," she said, "that's just what my stepdaughter said just now. 'Oh, take me to the Chamber of Horrors!' That's exactly what she did say when we got upstairs." A group of people, all talking and laughing together, were advancing from within the wooden barrier toward the turnstile. Mrs. Bunting stared at them nervously. She wondered which of them was the gentleman with whom Mr. Hopkins had hoped she would never be brought into personal contact. She thought she could pick him out among the others. He was a tall, powerful, handsome gentleman, with a military appearance. Just now he was smiling down into the face of a young lady. "Monsieur Barberoux is quite right," he was saying in a loud, cheerful voice. "Our English law is too kind to the criminal, especially to the murderer. If we conducted our trials in the French fashion, the place we have just left would be very much fuller than it is today. A man of whose guilt we are absolutely assured is oftener than not acquitted, and then the public taunt us with 'another undiscovered crime.'" "Do you mean, Sir John, that murderers sometimes escape scot-free? Take the man who has been committing all these awful murders this last month. I suppose there's no doubt he'll be hanged, if he's ever caught, that is." Her girlish voice rang out, and Mrs. Bunting could hear every word that was said. The whole party gathered round, listening eagerly. "Well, no." He spoke very deliberately. "I doubt if that particular murderer ever will be hanged." "You mean that you'll never catch him?" The girl spoke with a touch of airy impertinence in her clear voice. "I think we shall end by catching him because—" He waited a moment, then added in a lower voice, "Now don't give me away to a newspaper fellow, Miss Rose, because now I think we do know who the murderer in question is." Several of those standing near by uttered expressions of surprise and incredulity. "Then why don't you catch him?" cried the girl indignantly. "I didn't say we knew where he was. I only said we knew who he was, or rather, perhaps I ought to say that I personally have a very strong suspicion of his identity." Sir John's French colleague looked up quickly. "De Leipsic and Liverpool man?" he said interrogatively. The other nodded. "Yes, I suppose you've had the case turned up?" Then, speaking very quickly, as if he wished to dismiss the subject from his own mind, and from that of his auditors, he went on. 4 murders of the kind were committed 8 years ago, 2 in Leipsic, the others, just afterwards, in Liverpool. And there were certain peculiarities connected with the crimes which made it clear they were committed by the same hand. The perpetrator was caught, fortunately for us, red-handed, just as he was leaving the house of his last victim, for in Liverpool the murder was committed in a house. I myself saw the unhappy man. I say unhappy, for there is no doubt at all that he was mad. He hesitated, and added in a lower tone, suffering from an acute form of religious mania. I myself saw him, as I say, at some length. But now comes the really interesting point. I have just been informed that a month ago this criminal lunatic, as we must of course regard him, made his escape from the asylum where he was confined. He arranged the whole thing with extraordinary cunning and intelligence, and we should probably have caught him long ago, were it not that he managed, when on his way out of the place, to annex a considerable sum of money in gold, with which the wages of the asylum staff were about to be paid. It is owing to that fact that his escape was, very wrongly, concealed." He stopped abruptly, as if sorry he had said so much, and a moment later the party were walking in Indian file through the turnstile, Sir John Burney leading the way. Mrs. Bunting looked straight before her. She felt, so she expressed it to her husband later, as if she had been turned to stone. Even had she wished to do so, she had neither the time nor the power to warn her lodger of his danger, for Daisy and her companion were now coming down the room, bearing straight for the Commissioner of Police. In another moment Mrs. Bunting's lodger and Sir John Burney were face to face. Mr. Sleuth swerved to one side. There came a terrible change over his pale, narrow face. It became discomposed, livid with rage and terror. But, to Mrs. Bunting's relief—yes, to her inexpressible relief—Sir John Burney and his friend swept on. They passed Mr. Sleuth and the girl by his side, unaware, or so it seemed to her, that there was anyone else in the room but themselves. "Hurry up, Mrs. Bunting," said the turnstile keeper. "You and your friends will have the place all to yourselves for a bit." From an official he had become a man, and it was the man in Mr. Hopkins that gallantly addressed pretty Daisy Bunting. "It seems strange that a young lady like you should want to go in and see all those 'orrible frights," he said jestingly. "Mrs. Bunting, may I trouble you to come over here for a moment?" The words were hissed rather than spoken by Mr. Sleuth's lips. His landlady took a doubtful step towards him. "A last word with you, Mrs. Bunting." The lodger's face was still distorted with fear and passion. "Do not think to escape the consequences of your hideous treachery. I trusted you, Mrs. Bunting, and you betrayed me. But I am protected by a higher power, for I still have much to do." Then, his voice sinking to a whisper, he hissed out, "Your end will be bitter as wormwood and sharp as a two-edged sword. Your feet shall go down to death, and your steps take hold on hell." Even while Mr. Sleuth was muttering these strange, dreadful words, he was looking round, glancing this way and that, seeking a way of escape. At last his eyes became fixed on a small placard placed above a curtain. "Emergency Exit" was written there. Mrs. Bunting thought he was going to make a dash for the place, but Mr. Sleuth did something very different. Leaving his landlady's side, he walked over to the turnstile. He fumbled in his pocket for a moment, and then touched the man on the arm. "I feel ill," he said, speaking very rapidly. "Very ill indeed. It is the atmosphere of this place. I want you to let me out by the quickest way. It would be a pity for me to faint here, especially with ladies about." His left hand shot out and placed what he had been fumbling for in his pocket on the other's bare palm. "I see there's an emergency exit over there. Would it be possible for me to get out that way?" "Well, yes, sir, I think so." The man hesitated. He felt a very slight, feeling of misgiving. He looked at Daisy, flushed and smiling, happy and unconcerned, and then at Mrs. Bunting. She was very pale, but surely her lodger's sudden seizure was enough to make her feel worried. Hopkins felt the half-sovereign pleasantly tickling his palm. The Paris Prefect of Police had given him only half a crown. Mean, shabby foreigner! "Yes, sir, I can let you out that way," he said at last. "And perhaps when you're standing out in the air, on the iron balcony, you'll feel better. But then, you know, sir, you'll have to come round to the front if you wants to come in again, for those emergency doors only open outward." "Yes, yes," said Mr. Sleuth hurriedly. "I quite understand. If I feel better I'll come in by the front way and pay another shilling. That's only fair." "You needn't do that if you'll just explain what happened here." The man went and pulled the curtain aside, and put his shoulder against the door. It burst open, and the light, for a moment, blinded Mr. Sleuth. He passed his hand over his eyes. "Thank you," he muttered. "Thank you. I shall get all right out there." An iron stairway led down into a small stable yard, of which the door opened into a side street. Mr. Sleuth looked round once more. He really did feel very ill. Ill and dazed. How pleasant it would be to take a flying leap over the balcony railing and find rest, eternal rest, below. But no. He thrust the thought, the temptation, from him. Again a convulsive look of rage came over his face. He had remembered his landlady. How could the woman whom he had treated so generously have betrayed him to his arch-enemy, to the official, that is, who had entered into a conspiracy years ago to have him confined, him, an absolutely sane man with a great avenging work to do in the world, in a lunatic asylum? He stepped out into the open air, and the curtain, falling to behind him, blotted out the tall, thin figure from the little group of people who had watched him disappear. Even Daisy felt a little scared. "He did look bad, didn't he, now?" She turned appealingly to Mr. Hopkins. "Yes, that he did, poor gentleman. Your lodger, too?" He looked sympathetically at Mrs. Bunting. She moistened her lips with her tongue. "Yes," she repeated dully, "my lodger." End of Chapter 26. Chapter 27. In vain Mr. Hopkins invited Mrs. Bunting and her pretty stepdaughter to step through into the Chamber of Horrors. "I think we ought to go straight home," said Mr. Sleuth's landlady decidedly, and Daisy meekly assented. Somehow the girl felt confused, a little scared by the lodger's sudden disappearance. Perhaps this unwonted feeling of hers was induced by the look of stunned surprise, and yes, pain, on her stepmother's face. Slowly they made their way out of the building, and when they got home it was Daisy who described the strange way Mr. Sleuth had been taken. "I don't suppose he'll be long before he comes home," said Bunting heavily, and he cast an anxious, furtive look at his wife. She looked as if stricken in a vital part. He saw from her face that there was something wrong, very wrong indeed. The hours dragged on. All three felt moody and ill at ease. Daisy knew there was no chance that young Chandler would come in today. About 6 o'clock Mrs. Bunting went upstairs. She lit the gas in Mr. Sleuth's sitting room and looked about her with a fearful glance. Somehow everything seemed to speak to her of the lodger. There lay her Bible and his concordance, side by side on the table, exactly as he had left them, when he had come downstairs and suggested that ill-starred expedition to his landlord's daughter. She took a few steps forward, listening the while anxiously for the familiar sound of the click in the door which would tell her that the lodger had come back, and then she went over to the window and looked out. What a cold night for a man to be wandering about, homeless, friendless, and, as she suspected with a pang, with but very little money on him. Turning abruptly, she went into the lodger's bedroom and opened the drawer of the looking-glass. Yes, there lay the much diminished heap of sovereigns. If only he had taken his money out with him! She wondered painfully whether he had enough on his person to secure a good night's lodging, and then suddenly she remembered that which brought relief to her mind. The lodger had given something to that Hopkins fellow, either a sovereign or half a sovereign, she wasn't sure which. The memory of Mr. Sleuth's cruel words to her, of his threat, did not disturb her overmuch. It had been a mistake, all a mistake. Far from betraying Mr. Sleuth, she had sheltered him, kept his awful secret as she could not have kept it had she known, or even dimly suspected, the horrible fact with which Sir John Burney's words had made her acquainted, namely, that Mr. Sleuth was victim of no temporary aberration, but that he was, and had been for years, a madman, a homicidal maniac. In her ears there still rang the Frenchman's half careless yet confident question, "De Leipsic and Liverpool man?" Following a sudden impulse, she went back into the sitting-room, and taking a black-headed pen out of her bodice, stuck it amid the leaves of the Bible. Then she opened the book, and looked at the page the pen had marked. "My tabernacle is spoiled, and all my cords are broken. There is none to stretch forth my tent any more and to set up my curtains." At last, leaving the Bible open, Mrs. Bunting went downstairs, and as she opened the door of her sitting-room, Daisy came towards her stepmother. "I'll go down and start getting the lodger's supper ready for you," said the girl good-naturedly. "He's certain to come in when he gets hungry. But he did look upset, didn't he, Ellen? Right down bad, that he did." Mrs. Bunting made no answer. She simply stepped aside to allow Daisy to go down. "Mr. Sleuth won't never come back no more," she said somberly, and then she felt both glad and angry at the extraordinary change which came over her husband's face. Yet perversely that look of relief, of right-down joy, chiefly angered her, and tempted her to add, "That's to say, I don't suppose he will." And Bunting's face altered again. The old, anxious, depressed look, the look it had worn the last few days, returned. "What makes you think he mayn't come back?" he muttered. "Too long to tell you now," she said. "Wait till the child's gone to bed." And Bunting had to restrain his curiosity. And then, when at last Daisy had gone off to the back room where she now slept with her stepmother, Mrs. Bunting beckoned to her husband to follow her upstairs. Before doing so he went down the passage and put the chain on the door, and about this they had a few sharp whispered words. "You're never going to shut him out?" she expostulated angrily, beneath her breath. "I'm not going to leave Daisy down here with that man perhaps walking in any minute." "Mr. Sleuth won't hurt Daisy, bless you. Much more likely to hurt me." And she gave a half sob. Bunting stared at her. "What do you mean?" he said roughly. "Come upstairs and tell me what you mean." And then, in what had been the lodger's sitting room, Mrs. Bunting told her husband exactly what it was that had happened. He listened in heavy silence. "So you see," she said at last, "you see, Bunting, that 'twas me that was right after all. The lodger was never responsible for his actions. I never thought he was, for my part." And Bunting stared at her ruminatingly. "Depends on what you call responsible," he began argumentatively. "But she would have none of that. I heard the gentleman say myself that he was a lunatic," she said fiercely, and then dropping her voice. "A religious maniac, that's what he called him." "Well, he never seemed so to me," said Bunting stoutly. "He simply seemed to me 'centric, that's all he did, not a bit madder than many I could tell you of." He was walking round the room restlessly, but he stopped short at last. "And what do you think we ought to do now?" Mrs. Bunting shook her head impatiently. "I don't think we ought to do nothing," she said. "Why should we?" And then again he began walking round the room in an aimless fashion that irritated her. "If only I could put out a bit of supper for him somewhere where he would get it. And his money, too. I hate to feel it's in there." "Don't you make any mistake, he'll come back for that," said Bunting with decision. But Mrs. Bunting shook her head. She knew better. "Now," she said, "you go off up to bed. It's no use us sitting up any longer." And Bunting acquiesced. She ran down and got him a bedroom candle. There was no gas in the little back bedroom upstairs. And then she watched him go slowly up. Suddenly he turned and came down again. "Ellen," he said in an urgent whisper, "if I was you I'd take the chain off the door and I'd lock myself in. That's what I'm going to do. Then he can sneak in and take his dirty money away." Mrs. Bunting neither nodded nor shook her head. Slowly she went downstairs, and there she carried out half of Bunting's advice. She took, that is, the chain off the front door. But she did not go to bed, neither did she lock herself in. She sat up all night, waiting. At 7:30 she made herself a cup of tea, and then she went into her bedroom. Daisy opened her eyes. "Why, Ellen," she said, "I suppose I was that tired and slept so sound that I never heard you come to bed or get up. Funny, wasn't it?" "Young people don't sleep as light as do old folks," Mrs. Bunting said sententiously. "Did the lodger come in after all? I suppose he's upstairs now?" Mrs. Bunting shook her head. "It looks as if 'twould be a fine day for you down at Richmond," she observed in a kindly tone. And Daisy smiled, a very happy, confident little smile. That evening Mrs. Bunting forced herself to tell young Chandler that their lodger had, so to speak, disappeared. She and Bunting had thought carefully over what they would say, and so well did they carry out their programme, or what is more likely, so full was young Chandler of the long happy day he and Daisy had spent together, that he took their news very calmly. "Gone away, has he?" he observed casually. "Well, I hope he paid up all right." "Oh, yes, yes," said Mrs. Bunting hastily. "No trouble of that sort." And Bunting said shamefacedly, "Aye, aye, the lodger was quite an honest gentleman, Joe. But I feel worried about him. He was such a poor gentle chap, not the sort of man one likes to think of as wandering about by himself." "You always said he was 'centric," said Joe thoughtfully. "Yes, he was that," said Bunting slowly. "Regular right down queer. Leetle touched, you know, under the thatch." And as he tapped his head significantly, both young people burst out laughing. "Would you like a description of him circulated?" asked Joe good-naturedly. Mr. and Mrs. Bunting looked at one another. "No, I don't think so. Not yet awhile, at any rate. 'Twould upset him awfully, you see." And Joe acquiesced. "You'd be surprised at the number of people who disappears and are never heard of again," he said cheerfully, and then he got up, very reluctantly. Daisy, making no bones about it this time, followed him out into the passage and shut the sitting-room door behind her. When she came back she walked over to where her father was sitting in his easy-chair, and standing behind him she put her arms round his neck. Then she bent down her head. "Father," she said, "I've a bit of news for you." "Yes, my dear?" "Father, I'm engaged. Aren't you surprised?" "Well, what do you think?" said Bunting fondly. Then he turned round and, catching hold of her head, gave her a good hearty kiss. "What'll Old Aunt say, I wonder?" he whispered. "Don't you worry about Old Aunt," exclaimed his wife suddenly. "I'll manage Old Aunt. I'll go down and see her. She and I have always got on pretty comfortable together, as you knows well, Daisy." "Yes," said Daisy a little wonderingly, "I know you have, Ellen." Mr. Sleuth never came back, and at last, after many days and many nights had gone by, Mrs. Bunting left off listening for the click of the lock which she at once hoped and feared would herald her lodger's return. As suddenly and as mysteriously as they had begun, the Avenger murders stopped. But there came a morning in the early spring when a gardener, working in the Regent's Park, found a newspaper in which was wrapped, together with a half-worn pair of rubber-soled shoes, a long, peculiarly shaped knife. The fact, though of considerable interest to the police, was not chronicled in any newspaper, but about the same time a picturesque little paragraph went the round of the press concerning a small box full of sovereigns which had been anonymously forwarded to the governors of the Foundling Hospital. Meanwhile Mrs. Bunting had been as good as her word about Old Aunt, and that lady had received the wonderful news concerning Daisy in a more philosophical spirit than her great niece had expected her to do. She only observed that it was odd to reflect that if gentlefolks leave a house in charge of the police a burglary is pretty sure to follow, a remark which Daisy resented much more than did her Joe. Mr. Bunting and his Ellen are now in the service of an old lady, by whom they are feared as well as respected, and whom they make very comfortable. End of Chapter 27. End of The Lodger. Recording by Leanne Howlett.